basic people. I'm John Munitz.
And I'm Jackie Sawicki, and we're the People's Basics.
Today on the program, we're going to be breaking down yet another societal basic and, all the challenges that we got to address to secure it for all the people. Jackie, do you want to let the good people out there know what today's topic is?
Sure, John. Today we're going to be talking about education. But before we get into why education is such a fundamental basic for society, we'd like to ask that you please subscribe, join our social networks, and share with your friends. John, why do you think that that education is such a fundamental basic for society?
Well, I fundamentally think education is the pillar of a fundamentally, humane society, because it is how we as humans pass along information from generation to generation so that we are not having to constantly regress and reinvent the wheel, but instead we get to build upon the successes and, frankly, correct the failures of past generations. I think it's fundamental because it's how we learn the basic skills to be able to support ourselves as well as to be able to support others. I think that's why it's a fundamental pillar that we all should be guaranteeing to all people, because that's how you make a society functional when it all has certain common skills for self-sufficiency, knowledge of, shared understanding of how the world operates, and, frankly, applicable life skills so that they can be useful to each other in servicing each other's needs. That's why I kind of define education as such a basic fundamental role for society. How about yourself, Jackie? What makes education so important to you?
I mean, you summed it up pretty well there, but also in the sphere of politics, which we'll get into, we need to be able to tell the difference between true or not. And that should be one of the fundamental purposes of education, is to be able to help people differentiate, fact from fiction and know how to proceed accordingly. Like, if we aren't an educated, and it goes back to my favorite word again, empowered. Education is empowering. We can, know when somebody's trying to, pull our leg or something. So in the colloquial term, being educated, it's not just has to do with schooling. It has to do with just those life skills and knowing how to proceed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, over the month, we're going to be covering a variety of subjects on education. And so in today's episode, we're really primarily going to be focusing on primary education. But as you were just alluding to, education goes far beyond schooling. It could be the information systems that we've developed within society. It could be how we prepare parents to be able to take care of their kids. There's a variety of things that happen outside of the school setting, but we would be obviously remiss if we didn't start our education month focusing on the thing that we provide all of our kids, which is public primary education. And so I think the first area that I wanted to start on in covering public primary education is curriculum. And frankly, how do we, properly educate our kids? What is, the fundamental purpose of what an education should provide kids? So Jackie, I want to ask you first, what are some of the subjects that you think all kids should be getting taught, or at least all kids should have the option to be taught?
I guess first and foremost, we live in a digital culture now, so probably how to safely navigate the digital world, because a lot of children are preyed on, and elderly for that matter. So maybe just in general, again, that how to know truth from fiction, where to see red flags, that kind of stuff. The natural world, the American child is so disconnected from the natural world unless they're lucky enough to live, in and around nature. A lot of city kids, there's something about kids being able to recognize hundreds of logos, but very few plants and animals, something like that.
That is true.
Yeah. So maybe the natural world, getting in touch with this thing that we live in and around and immersed in it. We are part of nature, and it's just such a disconnect nowadays. And it's a shame. I was a Girl Scout. I was taught to respect and love and revere nature. That's why I'm witch. But like that's one of the things. Life and survival skills, being able to navigate the real world. I mean, there's book learning and there's experience, and I don't know that a lot of kids get experience. There's a lot of kids that are preyed on, credit card wise and stuff like that when they get out of high school. So finances, these very real skills that just are not being taught to people, and then they're preyed on by corporations or by the military recruiting them because they don't have many other options and all kinds of stuff. So communicating, well with others.
Yeah, and I wanted to build on that point because I actually think communication, which can be kind of an umbrella term, is one of the most like fundamental things that I think education teaches, not just in like the actual like book learning side of things, which is important, and we should be doing significantly more education in literacy skills so that people can learn whatever skills they want over time because they have that new ability to learn. But it's also the ability to simply, socialize with other peers, often in physical settings, that kind of acculturates you and learns how do you properly communicate with people who aren't, just your family. So I think that's a really big thing is, how do you actually have social relationships? That is something that is a very experiential relationship. It's kind of hard to study. How do you be friends with people through a book? Like, yes, there are books out there that do it, but it's never a perfect science. But there's too much individuality within it and too many diverse opinions that any one book can capture. But to add on, you mentioned like finance skills before. I actually would like to build off that a little bit in that I think, frankly, in our high school experiences, we generally don't do nearly enough like business education. And I say that not because I want everyone to go become a manager or work in the business world. I don't. But I think there are some fundamental skills that can help you, A, manage your own life, but B, and more importantly, I think it provides people the perspective that if they are working for someone else, they actually understand how those organizations operate. And so I'd love to see more experiences where kids are taught, operations and risk management skills, whether that be through, practical programs like trying to do like student run, like entrepreneurial ventures, or if it even is like doing things like playing with games to understand risk management skills. I think those would be great. And, coupled with that kind of entrepreneurial idea, I think we really need to be teaching kids, the process of creativity and innovation so that people are not just knowers, but they are doers and that they are creators. And, the last, I think, like area that I would focus on as well, I don't know if you might consider it part of life skills. I kind of want to just give it a separate call out. But I think self-defense is a skill that everyone should have. I think people should not have to be completely reliant on others for a form of protection. They should have this sense of self-sufficiency that they can take care of themselves. That doesn't mean we don't have support systems where others can come in and help provide us safety. But I think we would be in a better place if every single person had that proper skill set in place. Is there any other areas that you think we should be looking to do more in terms of curriculum?
I mean, the natural world, like I said, like growing gardens, teaching people how to produce more instead of just being consumers. We teach people how to be really good consumers in this country, but we really don't teach them too much about being producers. And that's kind of your business perspective too. I agree. And then also just, it's interesting how much stuff has changed just since I was in school. And, my mom, she's been out of school for a very long time and stuff has really changed then. So I almost even feel like there should be like continuing education, just every 5 years or so. It's like, hey, remember we taught you this? Yeah, that was wrong. Like, oh yeah, Pluto's not a
Oh
planet
boy.
anymore. We all know that.
I mean, heck,
But,
a lot of people just need that right now for like basic civics. I think it's like, hey, government's constantly changing. They should have some form of education available. And, beyond the continuing education, I think that reminds me of a great point. One of the subjects that we should have everyone be taught is, well, how does society function? Not just how do you be self-sufficient yourself, not just how does the natural world work, but how does the human systems in place operate? And so I think about subjects like sociology. I think about subjects like civics and history. These are subjects that are more often done in our public schools, but I then think there are other things that we can include as well, like comparative religion. Understanding all these different faith systems out there, because, I get some people feel skeptical about bringing religion into our public schools. I fully get that. But I don't want this as an indoctrination. I want this to be an awareness campaign of all the different beliefs out there, because I think people should be humbled by simply the amount of different beliefs of how the world operates, rather than feeling that there's this like one system that they're taught every Sunday or Saturday or whatever day of the week you practice. But I think that's important. And then the other thing of like kind of how society works is like, how do you get the skills that are being demanded right now by society? How do you be useful for the rest of society? And I think that comes with things like you said, kind of in a continuing education, but more so like vocational education, of which, we get people who, when they enroll in these courses, it generally can have some mixed results depending on like the level. So like some of the fundamental basic entry level vocational programs don't end up producing like high benefits for the individuals. They're usually just precursors for people to then be able to take more of the advanced courses. But the people who actually get through those intro courses and then get through their advanced courses, there's been significant study to say that each one of these upper level vocational programs does significant impact to be able to help students who are looking to simply get employed and get paid better. Roughly, you expect a 2% increase annually in pay based on each individual higher level vocational course you take. And as well, we find out that, more often than not, people are getting through the schooling process more often because they have a sense of a work ethic that's already been built from going through other schooling, but B, and more importantly so, people have a better sense of actually what they want to do. And so that, doesn't make them have to take as long getting through college because they know what they want to do. And so that doesn't have them face as much cost. It makes people, who might have gone down one major path who then end up hating it, and then dropping out, maybe not have that because they understand ahead of time of what they want to do. And, part of the problem is, vocational education in America is significantly less than a lot of the rest of the world. This is partly because we've been doing big budget cuts to it. Since 1985, there has been a 32% decline in federal funding. And obviously, if you're going to cut funding, you're probably going to have people take less credits overall. So in that same time period, vocational credit actually declined by 14%. So, this is a really big area where we can have people, before they go off to college and, really specialize even further, get a sense and build real skills. So I think that's a big thing that we can be doing a lot of investment in.
Yeah, and those vocational skills, those hands-on, real, useful skills can also be passed on to friends and family. That's something that's fun about tangible skills like that. It's something that you can share with other people. Not all skills are like that. But if you learn how to fix a car, you're more likely to teach your son or daughter how to do it. And that's kind of cool too, because that goes back to that first point of what is education, but, sharing our wisdom and collective knowledge.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think like the next thing that we should be talking about is now we've kind of talked about like what should be taught, but now we should talk about how do we assess if it's being learned. And, I think a lot of the focus in our current public education system has been mainly standardized testing, primarily because we've had, Common Core programs that have basically demanded this. And so there's also a bunch of different localities, depending on if they want to have like gifted programs or whatever, they use these standardized tests to try and sort out the different crowds. And, in theory, some of the positives around standardized tests are kind of a little obvious. That's why they are in place right now. They are, in theory, at least a metric for determining learning that we can have across different school systems. And it helps people potentially be able to pinpoint areas requiring improvement. However, there's a bunch of different potential drawbacks. Before I get into that, I wanted to hear, Jackie, how do you feel in general about like standardized testing?
As someone who grew up very ADHD with dyslexia and like severe learning disabilities, it was funny. I was good at tests, but my little sister, who she's not as ADHD. She had really bad test anxiety. So even though she was a great student, she would just completely freeze up and just do terrible. And so I don't think it's really a fair assessment of a child's ability and knowledge. It is a good way to, put all these kids into a little square hole, but it doesn't really give the full picture at all, obviously. But, it's really good at categorizing children and, alienating them and making them feel like total losers if they don't, conform and perform well. And, we've talked about stress a lot in our UBI for college student article, and what testing does to college students and high school students trying to get into their, preferred colleges and stuff. It's really, really extreme.
Yeah. And, I partly see that not as the necessary existence of the test and more so the weighting that it's given. I'm wholeheartedly agreeing with you that we put too much emphasis on these tests. But I do think that it is a form of metric, and it does allow certain students a little bit more freedom to demonstrate their skills in a different way. I know, for instance, a lot of school systems are going to have what's known as grade inflation. Some schools are easier on their students than others. And so if you leave it to just the subjective teacher metric, certain students who might have harder teachers in terms of just grading are going to be really detrimentally impacted compared to students who might have had people who do inflate grades. I know, for instance, that was a problem at my own school. Like when you start especially incorporating AP and honors classes that have boosted GPA levels for the same grade mark compared to not remedial, but like standard classes. You're going to have certain people just come out looking like they're smarter and get even GPAs above a 4.0. It can get crazy. But, to the point about like, what are some of those detriments to standardized testing, which leads us to believe that we should, deprioritize it? I think about this in two aspects, like the student side and then the teacher side. And so like, obviously on the student side, things like, graduation and school funding are being highly tied to these standardized tests, which you just mentioned, creates such undue stress. But it also, as you also pointed out, it's a standardized method that fails to account for, students who can, demonstrate academic proficiency in like other ways and may just struggle with multiple choice tests. So it doesn't account for that. You have things like, it places emphasis on only certain skills. The standardized tests primarily are reading, writing, and mathematics. But it doesn't do things like, are you a good artist? That's certainly a useful skill in society, but that's not part of a standardized test. All these vocational skills that we were talking about, all these things that you can be useful. I'm not saying that we shouldn't like have some sense of like good writing skills, good reading skills, good mathematics skills, but I think we limit ourselves when it comes to these tests. Mm-hmm. And then like I think the final one is like it takes some cultural dynamics and it kind of in a way unfairly biases against those who didn't necessarily start off as American, like or people who culturally maybe are second generation immigrants, and so their parents at home might be practicing different cultural standards than a lot of people who have been natives to America for a very long time. And so I think the testing has some things that don't properly take into account language deficiencies, learning disabilities, potential for the impact of having just difficult home lives. All these things can really influence a person when it's like a one-day test. I know, for instance, I'll give a personal story. I showed up for one of my exams with a fever that day. Am I going to do worse that day? I think so. Am I not? I'm more capable than that one day's test. Luckily, I was able to retake it again. But I think about the people who maybe don't have the money to do that, because taking the test more than one time costs money. And so maybe you just had a bad day and you weren't feeling well. Those are some of the problems I see for the students.
I mean, and I'm sure we'll get to this too, but child nutrition. There is a lot of science about children not getting adequate nutrition, and it absolutely affecting their grades and their school performance and their focus and all of the things. So, I mean, did we mention that? I mean, that should be one of the.
No, not yet. I think we're going to get into that when we talk about some of the, non-education services that schools still provide themselves. But just to wrap up on like standardized testing, the other point I said was, first it was the students, but the other side of the coin is the teachers. And when it comes to teachers, they have, a need to meet very specific testing standards, which kind of enforces this notion of teaching to the test rather than providing a broad curriculum or necessarily teaching to the individual student's capabilities. Furthermore, you have people who express frustration about, the time that it takes to have to actually prepare and administer these tests. They feel like there is an excessive amount of pressure that's put upon them, because not only are the students being graded on these standardized tests, but the teachers are too. And so it's like, okay, kids, like, you guys have my fate in your hands. Good luck today. And it's a horrible feeling.
Their salary is riding on it too a lot of times.
Yeah, yes, it is. And so and it's the problem for a teacher is, the teacher's goal isn't to say, I have all the smartest kids in the room, all the most capable kids. That's not what their job is. Like, they're going to get all ranges of capability. The job of a teacher should be improving the kids' skills. And the test doesn't measure improvement. It measures where you are today. And so that does a lot of injustice to the actual teachers within the process. I guess it's like, it just, I think, blames teachers kind of unfairly for certain areas of skills. Because most of the education is also being done like outside of the classroom too. Like, you don't have control over the full student's capability, and yet your whole livelihood is depending on these people basically doing well on this test, rather than you showing your ability to help improve these people. And so I think my final verdict when it comes to like standardized testing is that it can be a helpful metric in theory. I personally don't think it should be eliminated, but it needs to be reformed, and it needs to hold far less weight over holistic admissions as well as teacher evaluation. What would you say is your final conclusion when it comes to the subject of standardized testing?
That's kind of goes back to that question of reform versus like complete upheaval or revolution. Do we want to try to tweak the education system here and there, or do we want to envision a completely different education system for the 21st century? When did this kind of outline, this like standardized curriculum begin? A long time ago. So why keep using systems that don't really stand up to the needs of the 21st century's children. I don't know that standardized testing is a necessity if we're talking about creating a new education system, because then it goes to like, do tests really show a child's capability and ability? I don't really think so. I think a test says these kids are good at memorizing things. That's pretty much like, and regurgitating.
I will say that is a skill. I just think it shows only so many skills, which is why I think you are completely right. We need to reimagine the process. But I think even in a reimagined process, we're probably going to still have some form of testing to assess whether kids are learning.
Yeah, testing. But does that mean ABC? The testing that we think of as testing right now, or are we talking about?
Yeah, no, we're talking a new form. I just think we need some standard across the board so that we can actually have some reasonable levels of comparison of what is working and what is not working. But I think you're right that it's not going to accommodate for like every specific group of people particularly well. And I think, that can bring us to our next subject, which is really trying to handle for some of these kind of more special use cases, people who do have special needs within the classroom that need to be still accommodated, because very often public school is kind of trying to provide a very standard education for, the vast majority in the middle of like the bell curve. But we know that we need to be providing an education for everyone, and that frankly, people who are, potentially having disabilities, there's already costs that are associated with that make it hard for parents to potentially be able to afford private schools or other forms of education. So we still need to be making sure that our public education system provides well for students with disabilities. And so like some of the disabilities that I'm thinking about when it comes to like impact potentially on student performance, you mentioned one before, an ADHD that you have for your own family, but then there are also things like auditory processing disorder, cerebral palsy, dyslexia, dyspraxia, learning processing disorders, nonverbal learning disabilities, seizure disorders, physical disabilities. There is such a wide variety of things that people need that sometimes it can feel kind of difficult for educators as well as parents to feel like they are proficiently skilled and supported to be able to cope with trying to support these skills. Roughly, I think it's 35% of parents, according to a study by understood.org, say that parents feel serious concerns about their own capabilities to cope with their children's disabilities. And likewise, in that same study, they also found that 70% of educators believe that they were going to be struggling to be able to handle students with intellectual disabilities. And so, what is some of the impacts of these things, of having these disorders? Well, it can harm students in potentially having, reading and writing skills that are slower, needing to reread information or receive instruction multiple times. It could require additional time to process new material. Potentially, sometimes it'll cause someone to struggle to participate in classroom activity. It can be hard for some to be able to focus during classroom activities, or potentially, trouble participating in certain skills-based activities because they don't have the motor skills to be able to do that. There is also potentially social issues that can occur within a classroom because potentially they may not understand social cues, or they may have poor impulse control. You can have the physical limitations of potentially buildings aren't being constructed in ways to be accessible for people with disabilities to be able to freely traverse hallways or go from floor to floor. Potentially maybe kids are going to struggle because they simply can't see or hear the materials that the teacher is explaining, or maybe they can see and they have, as we said before, things like dyscalculia, which makes it hard for them to understand and process numbers. And so it definitely feels like there are a lot of issues that can be, present for the community. And I wanted to ask you, Jackie, what do you think are some of the things that we can be doing to help the disability community to be able to get a better education?
Well, you also missed a big one, mental health disorder or, illness. There is a lot of mental unwellness in the American school system and just America in general. And I don't know that these institutions are prepared in any way to deal with a lot of it. And it's not conducive. I don't know that high school or even junior high or elementary school is a really, it can be, but I don't know that it's nurturing. My experience was not a gentle, nurturing, positive, supportive experience. And I don't think the overwhelming amount of Americans can say that they had a great public school education experience. I think that a lot of people struggled at some point or another. So what we could be doing better, instead of having cops, we have more counselors and people like willing to actually listen to children. That's one of the things I love about Erica Rhodes is her Children Have a Voice campaign. Like, we say it's all for the children, it's the future is the children, but then we don't listen to their needs or their concerns. I mean, I remember being in like student council and stuff like that. And it was just something to keep us like occupied, and they thought it was cute, but like they didn't actually take anything that we had into consideration. So listening to kids, giving them mental health support, I think it's way more important that we are patient with children. I think that's another thing. Again, as someone who did not have a great time of it, I was ADHD and dyslexic, and I had a really hard time sitting still and controlling myself in my mouth. And I didn't always have the most patient or understanding teachers. I had very mean teachers sometimes. And that kind of goes to like teacher pay, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But if teachers aren't being venerated themselves, and they don't feel respected, and they don't feel like they're being, compensated, then nobody wants to work in a crappy job and not get paid for it. And it's super demanding, and they have to pay a lot of stuff out of their pocket. And then on top of it, you have all these rowdy kids. Well, when I was going to school, we were rowdy kids. Now, at least there is infrastructure and systems to, at least there are things that kids, like my nephew right now, he's super gifted. Like his IQ is really high, and they're actually creating a curriculum just for him. They didn't have that stuff back in my day, but they do have these kind of things nowadays. So more of that, when we talk about standardization, humans are not standard. We are not one size fits all, and our education shouldn't be that way. And so I think a thing that we could be doing is to like way more tailor our education system to the kids' interests, because that will keep them involved and engaged, and then you won't see that dropout and stuff like that. So maybe you can kind of, maybe more clubs too. I mean, a lot of kids are losing their arts and after school programs and stuff like that. And we know that also is really great for engagement and involvement and graduation. So there's that.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you on the notion that we do need to be giving a little bit more listening and respect to what the students are wanting. But I will say that I do think that there is a need for certain standards, because I think, as we can agree, there are certain key skills that everyone should have. There is certain knowledge that we think everyone should have within a society. And so I think we should be doing that. But then once it goes beyond that, yeah, we should be starting giving kids choice, and choice earlier than college. They should be getting to have that process in high school and middle school.
Yeah, but learning a specific skill, there are many ways to get to that. So even that standardization process of like learning how to add. Some people are visual, some people are tactile, some people are, cerebral. So that maybe we do some kind of classification for how you learn, and then kind of go from there. So we can still sort of, standardize, but not this one. Like, growing up when I was in my little rebel phase, it was like, oh, school is just teaching you how to conform and like be. And in a way, it kind of is just teaching you how to be a good manufacturing worker. Like, but that is a job of yesteryear. Like that doesn't exist anymore. So again, we need to have a kind of education for the 21st century. And kids are only more different than they were before. I mean, if not because they're allowed to be, we are individual creatures, and we should be, and that should be respected. And like I'm a visual learner, but I have to be forced to learn this way. Then it's like, trying to teach I don't know, something to swim. It's like, it just doesn't work, and that's where people get discouraged and they drop out. I consider myself intelligent, but I had to go to summer school for my last, for my grad. I did not walk across the stage. I did not graduate with my friends because of fucking math, So, and I consider myself intelligent. I got good grades on other stuff, and I'm creative, but that one subject held me back my entire life, and essentially like kept me from doing way more with myself.
Yeah, and I hate so that feeling so much.
Yeah,
because like Jackie, like the thing that I hate so much is that individual subjects, like a 1F, 1A, like makes or breaks so many kids' confidence. And I think fundamentally, like that is something we need to be building up in our kids, is this notion of confidence in what they are good at, rather than constantly beating them down with this, hey, you got to do these things and you're not good at it. So you got to constantly be reminded you're not good at this thing.
Yeah, you got to take
maybe it's just not. Yeah. And I think kind of that goes to a conversation that we'll have like later in the episode with Gisele Huff, as well as, frankly, the general notion of school choice that we're not going to cover today just because it's such a long and complicated subject. We're going to actually try and host a separate debate on the subject with other people to come in and discuss it. But, in terms of just like wrapping up on the subject of students with disabilities, to that point of confidence, I think that's like a vitally important thing for especially students with disabilities to kind of feel that they are not, incapable of being able to contribute and have skills. We need to be building them up with, tangible things that they can kind of accomplish and succeed at to build up that confidence. I mean, there's obviously things like generally just supporting teachers by building out more sophisticated teacher support systems so that they can lean on other teachers, and that they're staying organized so that they don't, they're clearing of distractions so that they can focus on the kids. And there's also, just kind of standardized materials like the IEP plans that people usually read to try and handle developing individualized coursing for students with disability. But then you also got things like, teachers, and this is kind of controversial for some, teachers embracing an advocacy role. When they're constantly facing these cuts, it impacts their ability to be able to do their job, and they need to be advocating for what they need to be effective in the classroom for themselves and for their students. So I highly encourage teachers, administrators to be advocates for what you need on a federal level, because it's political at the end of the day of how much funding you're going to get. So and I think that's really important.
Example too for students, when they see their teachers and their parents being involved in civics, that is going to, set a tone.
And I think another thing kind of like that is we should be fostering just like a sense of inclusion, that like when we bring this advocacy in, you also don't want to just be like preaching. You want to be like having a discussion and understanding and building almost partnership with your students. Especially, I think, teachers, one of the valuable things that they can do to be supporting their students with disabilities is trying to make sure that they feel included by partnering with students who do not have disabilities to be their partner in trying to support these other students. It's a valuable experience both for the student with disabilities to feel included and to be able to have more assistance, but it's also valuable for the student who is being that partner to the teacher in learning skills of how do you interact with people that have disabilities? How do you be more in a teaching role and supportive? I think these are skills that students should be learning, as well as not just how to learn, but how to teach too. How do you tell other people what you're thinking? How do you support other people who might be learning differently or understanding differently than you? I think that's a massively important thing for people to be able to learn. But to the model of just, how do we kind of transform things? How do we make the lives of teachers potentially easier? I think largely we have to start looking at how education is kind of changing today. Like, as you mentioned before, education kind of standards were designed over 100 years ago. Pretty sure it was like the end of the 19th century. A lot of these models of what were the core subjects of focus came at the end of the 19th century. But now we're in the 21st century. We got more and more technology, and that's kind of revolutionizing how schooling is being done. And I think for a lot of people who are listening to this now, people who might be parents, you might be having your kids taking school from home right now. Mobile education has been one of the biggest, I guess, innovations, frankly, in the 21st century in terms of how education models are being done. So how do we actually deliver a quality mobile education? Because we know more and more often we're going to likely have people pursuing those paths. So like some of the things that I think about when it comes to like doing proper mobile education is we have to make sure that there's first and foremost accessibility, device accessibility. Do you have a device? Do you have the internet to be able to take these courses? Roughly 7% of Americans right now don't have internet at all, like any form of it. And I assure you the higher percentage, depending on the specific mobile device you're talking about, exceeds that. If we're talking just like smartphones, that is at 81% of people having that right now. That means 19% of people don't. So the first thing you got to do is make sure if you want to expand mobile education, you're going to make sure more people can actually participate in mobile education. But Jackie, what are some of the things that you think about when it comes to mobile education? It's clearly a trend that's on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah, I mean, not having internet is one thing, but having bad internet is another. As several folks on the People's Basics team can attest, myself included, being out in rural Texas, it's so frustrating trying to do work on a bad connection or a slow connection. That can be very off-putting and can lead to dropout. So when we talk about mobile education, we need to talk about good high-speed infrastructure throughout all of America. It is the 2021. Why we don't have this already is infuriating. So that is a huge one. Also, like, again, everybody learns differently. So there are kids who are not doing well in mobile, but some are. Yeah. So, that mixed kind of amalgamation of like what works and what doesn't, we need to be flexible. That's a huge thing. We need to be flexible in everything. But, with kids, we need to be flexible. If they're learning well on mobile, awesome. If not, then we need to figure out other solutions. And, I like outdoor schools too. I think that's a really neat. One of my nephews did a really cool hands-on, almost like wilderness school, like where it's up in Massachusetts. They do all their schooling outside. And I think that's such a neat concept as someone who like totally loves nature and all of the real world skills and knowledge, and just like, that's just such a neat setting to learn. And it's conducive to learning. We learn better out in nature. There's studies on that too. Like being surrounded by trees is great for stress levels, all these kind of things. There are, we could do that in mobile too. We don't have to be inside of a building all the time either.
This is true. One of the benefits of mobility is, well, it's flexibility. If you're mobile, you can be wherever you need to be. Yeah. And, you know, I think to your point, it's obviously some kids learn better in one versus another, but there's definitely some positive impacts when it comes to just mobile learning, especially when it comes to the notion of like continuing education too. This has found way more user engagement when it comes to continuing education models, roughly a 72% increase compared to in-person models. Now, it might be a little bit different for children, and, you know, having built up some of the more social skills and also providing a form of potential childcare for parents and et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to adults trying to continue their education, mobile learning has been vitally important for these people, and it offers a little bit more flexibility in how you actually do curriculum design, because the timing can be a lot more flexible too. Like when you think about primary education or in-person education, well, that means you need a teacher to show up at a specific time. You need the kids to show up at that specific time. You got to do the test at that specific time. Like there's so many things you got to do at a specific time. Mobile education frees you up to be able to do it at more times a day, and maybe even in shorter segments. Like you can have a lot of the times, a lot of the ways people consume content today, and maybe the audience here is a little bit different because you're listening to a long form podcast, but a lot of people tend to consume their information in shorter bites. Yeah. And so what you have from mobile education is you can now administer models that administer short form education periodically throughout the day, coupled with micro assessments on those lessons rather than huge stress-inducing tests. You're being assessed along the way. And these models have shown that it increases generally like completion rates of their courses and produces higher learning retention. But I would say like the last things that we should be like obviously looking at when it comes to like mobile education is you gotta have it, as we've been talking this whole time. Personalization is very key. And frankly, you should be trying to make it in a way that's kind of like fun in a way, kind of like even if it is a game. 80% of users when polled on mobile education have said that they would like the system to be designed more like a game, because guess what? Learning, and we hope we're doing this here, should be fun. If you want to have it be retained, it should be memorable. You shouldn't be just sleeping through the class. If you want to learn, you should have these people be energized, and games are literally designed to get people not just, interacting, learning, but it's interacting. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so that's a big thing with education. And I would say, just to round out the conversation on like technology in classrooms, I think there's also, go right ahead. With
mobile education, also something we're not talking about is the fossil fuels consumed by, legions of school buses all over the country. I mean, this is, every time we stay home, every time we don't get in our car and turn it on is a win for the environment. So maybe we should take that into consideration as well. And we know that, getting kids to school sometimes is very difficult. I was one of those kids that was late to school every day,
Oh boy, you're not alone.
Yeah.
I will say this traumatic, too. To that point, like transportation, when you actually have to get to a physical location, and you also have to pick up other people along the way, because that's how buses work. Mm-hmm. You have to leave a lot earlier than school starts. Right. And so I know from my own personal experience, I had to leave roughly like 45 minutes to an hour in advance. And that means I had to wake up really early. That is a very hard process for kids, which kids hate doing. But to go back to the point about other forms of technology that are going to be helping the education process, some of the things that I think about are location-based technology. That way you can have more of the actual education that's being administered actually have relevance to the area. I think you can also have, kind of coupled with that same tool, you can incorporate like machine learning, so that it's starting to learn your habits and what your skill set deficiencies are and what you are interested in. And it can start learning over time what is kind of needed to be produced. And furthermore, like we can kind of keep going based off this if we want to expand. location-based technology plus things like, I don't know, augmented reality can be an even more interesting educational experience. You were talking about wanting to be outdoors.
Yes.
Well, imagine you could just bring the whole classroom setting as an augmented reality to your outdoor environment.
Yeah.
Seems like a wonderful thing to me. And I guess the last thing I want to bring up is also the notion of like voice assistants. Kind of like we've already had this kind of convenience level of like searching via the web. But when you take it to a voice assistant level, it can be an even like smarter search engine and task completer for you, like as a personal assistant. And I think about this more so, not even necessarily from the student level, but from like the teacher level, as having almost like an assistant in the classroom. I think that would be a very helpful thing for us to be looking into. But obviously, this is going to go into our next subject, which is, well, these things cost money. And how do we fund the education system? But before we go into that, do you have any final thoughts you wanted to share on technology in our education process, Jackie?
It's obviously not being utilized enough. I say all the time, like, we have ultimate knowledge at our fingertips. Like, people in olden times would just be blown away by the amount of information that we have in our pockets. It's incredible. And, you know, you can't, some people are just born inquisitive and want to learn. You can't force that on some people, but you can entice people to learn about things they're interested and passionate about. And I think that that's where we really could be utilizing technology a lot more. It's like, what are you passionate about? Okay, then let's put that into the frame of reference of how we're going to educate you. I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. But let's now talk about the funding. As I mentioned, all these things that we want to be able to do are going to require us to do some funding. And we'll talk about, again, as you mentioned before, supporting those teachers after this. But I think it's interesting to note, how do we actually fund education in America? And so when you look at the breakdown of how things are allocated, most of the funding comes from the state and local level, roughly 88% in total, 44% from the local, 44% from the state. And usually when it comes to local taxes, it can vary, but most of it's going to come from property taxes. You know, roughly 35% of that total 44% comes from property taxes locally. And then when it comes to state taxes, usually that comes from like income taxes and potentially sales taxes. And those make up 88% of the education compared to that 12% from the federal level. And when it comes to like what's the cost? It doesn't matter what the allocations are. How much are we actually spending on education? Well, the cost per student right now in America, on average, is roughly $14,439 a year per student. And so, well, what does that roughly come out to in terms of those costs? As we broke it down into the percentages before, that means roughly the state and local governments are allocating $6,353.16 per student, each of them allocating that, and the federal government is allocating $1,732.68. And so, you know, obviously we've decided that most of the focus of how we fund these systems are coming from the local level. Jackie, how do you feel like hearing those numbers? Do you feel like that's an appropriate balance of how we fund education from state, local, and federal, or do you think that needs to be rebalanced?
It seems awfully low from the federal level, and to put the burden on the state wholly. But I mean, we spend a lot on kids, don't we? Or do we? What's our compared to the other nations and stuff?
I mean, we are certainly
for the entire K through 12. That doesn't seem like.
I mean, yeah, it's not like
oh, my bad.
How much over a lifetime? It's 1 year. So it's relatively kind of on par The federal level of spending is a little bit less. You are correct on that point compared to some other nations. But the overall spending levels is actually fairly reasonable for America. It's mainly, in my opinion, we have, I obviously gave you an average, but we have severe disparities of how much is given because so much of it is focused locally. And if you think about it, a local area, when most of that taxes is coming from property tax, if you have a poor area, that's generating less income compared to a rich area. And that means a poor area is going to get worse education than a rich area, which means you're going to have these constant poverty traps of you not getting a good education because you lived in a poor area, so you're going to stay poor. And so I think we should be looking to move more of that funding allocation to the federal level. There's cases to be made on whether we want to increase overall spending or not, but I do think we should be looking to have an increase of that federal amount. When I ran for office, I ran on the idea of we should have it be $5,000 from the federal level per student, compared to the $1,732.68 currently. So I definitely think we need to be increasing it there. But when it comes to like the actual spending, like what are we spending so much money on? Most of it's actually going just to employees. It should make sense. It's not as much the admin, rent, all that. It's 80% of it's going to employee salaries and benefits. And we'll talk more about that kind of over time of how a lot of this has now started going more towards administrators than teachers. But a lot of the benefits or a lot of the spending on education is labor costs. And when you think about the actual change in per pupil costs, if you take basically constant dollars in like 2013, like standardize it for inflation, the cost of education per student from 1969 to 2012 rose 131%. So we are over time over doubling how much we are willing to spend on students. And I think that's appropriate. I think we should be consistently increasing it over time. But yeah, that is where we're at currently when it comes to funding. But I think let's talk about, well, what are we, that labor cost, what are we spending it on? How are we supporting teachers? And frankly, who are we really spending the money on? And so let's talk about teachers, because we obviously say we're spending a lot of money on the staff, but if you talk to teachers, they feel vastly under-supported. And so, Jackie, I wanted to hear from you. What do you think are some of the big problems that teachers are facing right now?
The problem, like they're not being funded adequately. I think having to create their own curriculum, I think, is super time consuming. They should have maybe we were talking about not being standardized, but kind of different ones already pre-planned to choose from so that they're not spending so much time creating this curriculum and they can actually get to the business of teaching. I think there's a lot of side work that teachers do that maybe can be offloaded or delegated. And again, that goes to funding. Like maybe teachers need real assistance and maybe not just AI, or the AI can help, anything like that. Just giving them more help, more resources, more developmental resources for these kids with disabilities. And also when I was, and again, it might have changed, but I don't think so. When I was in elementary school, I lost some really great teachers because the school was filled with asbestos and they wouldn't change it. So we had a lot of great teachers quit. So there's that too. I mean, the actual environment that you work in is huge. And if it doesn't feel good, then you don't want to be there. Maybe schools should be beautiful places. I mean, this is kind of a permaculture principle, but just like functional and beautiful. There's something to be said about just trying to do things and be productive in a beautiful environment. So I think that could be a big help too.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a real quality of life improvement for teachers. But I think the big thing for me is I do feel like generally teachers just have too many roles. Kind of similarly to how police do too many things, I think teachers do too many things, and they need to have their roles kind of lifted off their backs a little bit. Now, I'm not saying like some would in defunding teachers. No. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. I just said before, fund them. Yeah. And so, there are things, what are they spending time on that they shouldn't be as much? Well, they do a lot of time for administrative work right now. They do a lot. They don't have enough time to do planning activities for course development. They have to spend more time than they might want to on different stakeholder management things of being a communicator to a bunch of different groups, whether it be administrators or parents or principals or other faculty within their department. There's a bunch of different areas where this is kind of taking away time from, focusing on the lesson plan development and what their kids need. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, like, there's also some like things around like helping them handle, child discipline. And frankly, they need to have a little bit more of a relationship with the parents. They need parental buy-in to basically make what they're teaching in the classroom actually get upheld as behavior practices in the home. So I think we should be having not just a teaching of kids, but I think we need to have a periodic teaching session with parents. And not just parent-teacher conferences where they report on the status of your kid, but regularly teaching them of, well, what have they been taught? What should they be learning now? What are practices that would be good for you to teach at home? I think those are great things for people to, be able to do to get buy-in, to take the 70% of time where kids are not in the classroom, not in school, and continue the education outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about education and teachers, but we're not talking about parents. I mean, the parents are just as much responsible for their children's education as a teacher, especially if your kids don't have the greatest teachers, because maybe you do live in a poorer neighborhood where they don't have the resources to pay teachers very highly. I grew up in a very poor neighborhood, and my mom made sure that I knew how to read before I went to school. And this area was so bad that my sisters, when my mom and stepdad married, my stepdad didn't know how to read. My stepsisters didn't know how to read, and one was my age. So my mom taught my stepfather and my stepsisters how to read well beyond the ages that they already should have known how. Mm-hmm. And that's a poor Texas education. And we still have a very unequal, but my mom was not going to let that get in the way. She wanted better for us. So she did insist that we do that, like that we know how to read, and that we do, she was very strict and stuff on our schoolwork. So if she had just left it to the whims of the school and the randomness of whatever teachers I got, I probably wouldn't be, as proficient. I probably wouldn't be the editor of the People's Basics. Yeah. But so parents have a lot of responsibility, and I think it's very unfair to put all of education on the teacher's shoulders. Parents need to be way more involved. My mom had 2 jobs and was going to night school, and she was still in the PTA. She was my school. She was my Girl Scout troop leader. She was absolutely involved in she was my softball coach. I mean, my mom didn't have time or money to be doing any of this stuff, and she still did it. So parents, step up your game. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just say shout out to all the moms out there that juggle all those things, because it's like I know that there are dads out there that are plenty capable, but I have a personal connection to that. My mom was a rock in being able to juggle so many things, and I hear that so often from so many people. And so when we're talking about lifting some of these burdens off of teachers' shoulder and putting more responsibilities on parents, I want to stress we are also wanting to take burdens off of parents' shoulders
sure.
so that they can take on these responsibilities.
Yes.
But I think the thing I wanted to talk about, we were talking about supporting teachers, and I think in theory, and probably also in practice, one of the main groups that is supposed advocates on behalf of teachers are teachers' unions. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons to teachers' unions. And so I wanted to ask you first, Jackie, before we launch into that, what are your general sentiments on teachers' unions? Are you generally more in favor of them, or do you generally oppose them, or are you somewhere in the middle?
I mean, I'm in Texas, so I've been told to believe that unions are awful. I also, I don't know. It's very conflicting. Like, I don't think we should protect teachers that aren't performing well and that aren't dedicated to the craft. But I also think, like, unions are powerful because they give people, again, I'm going to always go back to empowerment. Like, unions are empowerment to workers. So I'm sure that, like all systems, there is threads of corruption and things don't, can get kind of mired. But for the most part, I think it's a good thing that workers have a say in their environment, in their salary, in the curriculum that they have to, I don't know. It's it's a lot. I don't know.
I think that's a very reasonable position, because I actually have a very similar feeling. Like, when it comes to private unions, I'm wholeheartedly supportive. 100% will back unions on private interests. We do that ourselves. Anyone in our network wants to form a union, we're a co-op, we encourage that. Private organizations should have unionization, and members should have that. I think it gets a bit more complicated when it becomes public unions, like public job unions, public labor unions, I should say, because you have to understand, who are you negotiating against in that circumstance. It's not a private individual. It's usually people who are looking for service benefits. And so I think there's actually a good case for there being both pros and cons to teachers' unions, and that potentially it's an improvement of the process that is required. Because, some of the benefits of teachers' unions is that, well, at least in theory, they help protect teachers against political changes. And you can argue whether or not they represent the full will of their teacher base, whole other question. But in theory, they are helping to be that organizer for teachers on a political level, so that they can have a bigger voice in demanding what teachers need. Furthermore, some people would argue that it helps in job security, so that you can be more innovative and take more potential risks in how you teach, from doing what you had some conflict with before, which is a very reasonable debate of tenure. Some would say that is a benefit because it gives teachers that security. And then I'd say the last benefit that generally can be cited is that generally schools with full unionization tend to produce higher education results for their students. So, countries that have 100% unionization level in their schools, like Finland and Singapore, they produce better results for their students than the schools in the United States. And even within the United States, we have, certain states that have a little bit higher unionization rates than others. So obviously, blue states generally are going to be a little bit more union backing than red states. And so we got states like Maryland and New York, which have higher unionization rates, outperforming some red states like Louisiana and Mississippi that have low unionization rates. And when you look at the Washington Post, they reported that out of the 10 non-union states in the U.S., only Virginia has an average rank above the median for education, and that 7 of the 10 states are in the bottom 15 in performance. So that is the pro side of teachers' unions. They are supposed to help the teachers politically. They can help provide some more job security, and they, on average, are producing higher quality education results. The cons, on the other hand, are that, they can reduce educational opportunities for students. Like if teachers need to strike that's days where kids are not getting an education. It can basically lock districts potentially into taking some bad contracts, which can hurt their overall budget that might need to be provisioning other social services potentially. They may funnel funds into places where the teachers might not be wanting them. For some of the teachers, it could be, instead of, emphasizing educational opportunities, teachers unions are, part of the process that changes the schools into more of an economic opportunity. Children shouldn't be, caught in the struggle between like teachers and administrators who are looking for resources in specific places. And I mean, finally, like as you said before, teachers unions can make it really hard to remove a bad teacher, kind of similar to the police union problem. And so like in an interview with the Daily Beast, Terry Moe, who was a professor of political science at Stanford, said that it took an average of $200,000 to remove just one poor teacher and up to 2 years of time to do so. So these are some of the arguments back and forth. I generally have a very mixed opinion on the subject. I generally have just problems with public labor unions being able to deny services to the public, but I see that they do produce better results too for their kids. So I'm mixed here. Do you have any final thoughts you wanted to share on teachers unions, Jackie?
I mean, I've had some really great teachers, and I hope that they were in unions and got paid well, because this is another thing. I don't know if we're going to get to it, but teachers in other countries are like really venerated and respected. And here we kind of like look down on teachers as not the greatest profession. Like, we kind of just, a lot of people denigrate them because they're not millionaires and stuff. So maybe if we need to be paying teachers more, and we also need to respect that position, because they're literally like molding future generations. They are taking care of your kids every single day. They do so much, and they deserve like every single solitary scrap that they can get, honestly. Like, we don't, like, we give a lot of lip service to teachers, but it's a tough job, and people, it's a special person. And I've had some really great teachers that have completely changed my life. And I love you, Mrs. Wiest. Whatever they can get good for them.
Yeah, and to that point, to just kind of put into perspective, what is that compensation level? Again, I'm going to give you an average, and that does mean that there is going to be 50% of people, or not 50% of people, that's not how averages work, that would be a median, but there's going to be a large portion of people who are less, and then there are going to be people who are more. The average right now in terms of teacher salary in America is $63,930. Now that means that would be a reasonable wage if everyone was receiving it. But again, that's the average. It's not the minimum. That's the average. And so that means there are a lot of people who are going underfunded in terms of their salary. And still, as we said, their schools are being underfunded. And so a lot of the times these teachers are taking out of their own pockets to buy supplies for these schools. And so that does not fly when you're just not even compensating the teachers at a reasonable level. And part of this is largely because where is the funding going? It's going more and more not towards teachers, not towards the education. It's going towards administration. And we can see this very clearly when we look at the period of like 2000 to 2017. School district administrative staff in that period of time increased 74.9% to a total of 170,158 positions. Principals and assistant principals increased 33.4% to a total of 189,155. And teachers in that period of time only increased 7.7% to 3,169,750. So that's roughly 228,289 new teachers compared to a combined 120,251 new administrators. When we look at this, we obviously have to compare what are the pay rates. As we said before, the pay rate for a teacher was around $63,000. The average administrator's compensation goes way above that. They get paid $100,340 on average. And when we look at like how these pay rates have been changing over time, we see that there has been, yes, technically a larger growth rate for teachers, but a nominal pay raise larger for administrators. So, administrators' pay in 1999 was $65,480, which represents, between those two periods of time, a 53.24% growth rate. Teachers' pay in 1999 was $39,560, representing a 61.6% growth rate. And so this represents a growth in terms of pay for administrators that exceeds the pay increase for teachers. Yes, the percentages are larger for teachers, but the actual amount of money was more given to the administrators. And when you compare the overall staffing levels now, administrators now are making up roughly like 2.2, 2.5%. And back in the day, they were representing 1.6%. But now teachers are only 50.3% of the staff compared to back in the day being 52.4% of the staff. So that overall percentage is shrinking. So we're not focusing as much anymore on providing teachers. We're spending more and more on administrators, which I'm curious. Do you think that we should be, considering this at this degree? Obviously, I said before, it's only 2.2% of the staff compared to 50%, but do you think we need to have more administration in our schools?
I mean, I've heard this before, but what are they administering? Is this to conform to like regulations and testing and all that stuff? Like,
that is a lot of it. It's the assessment process. It's evaluating teachers. It's negotiating with the unions. It's all that back office type of stuff to make sure that the schools are functioning to compliance.
Right. So increasingly complex systems.
Yeah.
We'll have to increasingly start hiring people to manage the complexity. So it's a self-fulfilling,
and the system, frankly, kind of becomes more complicated as administrators add more process to the mix. So I do think
more burden on the teachers. So I'm assuming these
that's one more stakeholder group they're going to have to work with.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we can't say, just get rid of them all, but this goes back to the question of reimagining what education is. Would we need so many administrators if we weren't going the standardized testing route? And so that's another college. That's question. The reason the college is so expensive now, is because of the administration.
It's definitely true.
Yeah, so,
and we'll definitely go into that more when we do our next podcast focused on like the expansion of education. But I think I wanted to focus, I guess, on what are some of those replacement funding things that what would we like to be spending on, maybe instead of administrators, maybe instead of, as you said before, on policing in schools. And that's some of the vital services that our, primary public education system provides or should provide, and some is lacking. And so to me, that's things like sustenance, things like lunch and breakfast. And it's also things like having school counselors, nurses, just general student health. Like if it maybe beyond just like an advisor of a student counselor, like someone who you can actually talk to, like a therapist in a way. I think those are the things that we kind of need. And I think the first part I wanted to focus on, which is just crazy to me, is how we do food in our schools. Like obviously we could first talk about like what is the benefit? Like why do we even do these things? I think it's fairly obvious if I told you kids who are hungry don't do as well. they're distracted. They're not thinking as clearly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so like research shows that receiving free or reduced price school lunches reduces food insecurity. It reduces obesity rates because, again, you're now getting not just the junk food and cheap calories. You're at least getting something that's a little bit more nutritious than that.
Right.
And it helps reduce generally poor health. And so things like behavioral, emotional, and mental health things are very directly tied to your physical well-being. Like, you have that whole like Snickers ad, like you're not yourself when you're hungry. I think that's very clearly evident when we're talking about kids, especially who have even less ability to emotionally regulate. And that's frankly one of the skills I should have mentioned before when we were talking curriculum. Is part of mental health is understanding emotional regulation. But why are these things exactly happening? We could go all day about like people being tardy and absent more often when they're hungry or more likely to get suspended. There are so many negatives, but like, why is this happening? It's because, it's because they took a financial hit. The School Nutrition Association said that 70% of school meal programs had taken a significant financial hit since new mandates have gone into effect, roughly during the tail end of the Obama administration, as well as, again, depending on the states, a lot of different states individually had their own mandates. So we're facing major budget cuts. And even when it comes to the things that they're delivering today, like one of the remaining things, kids aren't loving it. Like there's been studies where you have this one study at in Fairfax, Virginia, that found that 77% of the kids did not like the taste of their cafeteria food. And half of them said that they only ate their school lunch 2 or less times per week. So you think about that. It's, they're going to feel like, oh, the kids aren't even eating our lunch. Why do we even bother providing these services? Let's just keep cutting it. When in fact, it's the exact opposite. It's that kids would love to have, lunch. They're having growing levels of debt, but they just don't want to eat gross food. And so, to talk to that debt number, 75% of school districts have some level of school lunch debt today. And of those, 40.2% of them say that lunch debt levels are increasing. The median amount of school lunch debt right now per school district is $2,500, and it can go up all the way to near $1 million for certain school districts in America. And this may seem crazy to you because it's not like the individual lunches are super expensive on average. Roughly the average lunch cost in America is roughly like $3. So, that being the case, you have to ask yourself, why is it happening? I mean, to be fair, it's general poverty in America. People wouldn't be having as much trouble with these debts if we had a better overall economic situation and people weren't relying on programs like SNAP that are insufficiently covering their need for nutrition. But it's also because, not every area has free school lunch or free breakfast, which would just completely eliminate the problem. So, those are some of the levels that we're at right now. And to get even more detailed, in terms of the National School Lunch Program, and this is like average daily participation, there are nearly 100,000 schools and institutions that are serving school lunches to roughly 29.6 million students each day, which includes 20 million free lunches, which is good. That's a large portion. But then you got the rest. You got 1.7 million, which are reduced price, which students will generally pay something like 40 cents on average. And then you get like 7.7 million at full price. And then you have 4.9 billion lunches in general that are being served annually. And then when it comes to breakfast, this is a little bit less of a supported effort. Like you only have over 90,000 schools supporting this, with only 14.77 million students served each day, roughly half the amount of lunch. This includes 11.8 million free school lunches per day, 0.74 million or 740,000, reduced price, roughly at 30 cents per day, and 2.23 million full price meals. And this comes out to roughly 2.45 billion breakfasts served every year.
And the thing about breakfast is that you have to be there early to get it.
This is true.
So that's probably why it's not as big. I saw that Biden extended, the emergency free lunches into this year, and I saw somebody go like, "Oh, so we could have just been doing this the whole time." Like this is one of those things that just makes me outraged that number one, that we are the richest country, in the world, and we have so many children in poverty and so many children that are food insecure, which is just a polite way of saying we have hungry children in this country, which is just like, it's not acceptable. Like, we have infinite resources for destabilizing other countries, but when it comes to feeding children, which we know will help them perform better in school, we'll deny them that. We'll say, you owe too much. You haven't paid your school lunch debt. You don't get to eat. That's outrageous.
Yeah, and it adds some stigma to the time. And frankly,
Absolutely.
I this is a bit assumptive of me, but I'd imagine it also adds potential bullying because it makes it very clear certain students who are in poverty compared to others, because it's a very public display at times where at the worst case scenario, you're being told to return your lunch. And in the best case scenario, best case scenario is this doesn't happen. But in the best case scenario where there is debt being administered, you're simply telling the kid, hey, you got to pay up. And you're still announcing that. So, that's definitely got a weigh on people's mental health beyond the fact that they might be going hungry. Yeah. And so
it's like obviously one more thing for them to worry about. But if we're forcing kids to go to school, then we should feed them.
Yeah, I agree. If it's mandatory, you got to feed them.
They don't go. Right. Yeah,
that's exactly it. That's a great point. It's like you're not forcing the prisoners to buy their food. We provide it because they have to be there. Kids have to be there. Like, there are literally truancy laws in a lot of different places of the country that force you to be there, or you will be like criminally prosecuted. No, well, not criminally, civilly prosecuted for that offense. I 100% agree. The least we could do is feed them.
We feed them, John.
Yes, we want to feed them. Nancy Pelosi, do it. Actually feed them.
Just do it. It's quite easy, actually. Yeah.
And could you imagine putting that for a House vote and then getting hundreds of Republicans being like, nah, we want kids hungry.
Right. Just think of the money that we spend on campaigns that either party spend on campaigning, we could feed children. It's obscene.
But let's now talk about beyond the food. There are more services. We've been talking about the mental health side. And so we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about counselors. And so let's talk about where they're supposed to be, which is they're supposed to be trying to target, according to the professional standards that have been set, that there should be basically one counselor for every 250 students, one nurse and one psychologist for every 750 students, and every 700 students, there should basically be, either some safety services, that's debatable or not, but this is how we had recommendation from the ACLU. And so that is where their target's at. Right now, the student to counselor ratio is 411 to 1. So that's exceeding that 250 standard. And 10% of schools have no counseling at all. So we are not, presenting anyone who's hitting with these standards. And holistically, 90% of schools don't hit that standard we just said above. So we are vastly underfunding the support services, and this is going to have big impacts, especially when, if everyone's recalled, this, during this century, we've had a big increase in child suicide rates. Obviously, some of that is kind of tied to potentially social media, but it's also because we are, increasingly having larger class sizes and underfunding of services where people can go actually get time to talk to people.
And we know, again, it goes back to poverty and mental health issues go hand in hand. So we have a high childhood poverty. We're going to have high childhood anxiety and stress and mental unwellness. And then we need more counselors, not less. So this is just another way we're failing children, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, students in general are 21 times more likely to visit school-based health centers for treatment than anywhere else. Like there is a stigma for kids to go seeking out support, but when it's in their school system, they generally feel like it's convenient and that it's kind of actually maybe understanding more of their experience. They are in the setting, they understand how things potentially are working for them. And so, schools that employ more school-based mental health providers usually, in general, see improved attendance rates, lower rates of suspension and other disciplinary incidents, lower expulsion rates, improved academic achievement and career preparation, and overall higher graduation rates. So, data shows that when the school staff who provide health and mental health services to our children not only improve the health outcomes for those students, but they also improve school safety, and they help the teachers have a better experience as well. They help the teachers have higher mental health capabilities as well. And so I again encourage you all to read this data. It's at the ACLU if you want, and we're going to drop you a bunch of handy dandy links down below to really learn about how we need to be investing in these services rather than what I think we're going to get into as our final topic of our conversation today, which is really handling abuse that kind of is detected within the school system, whether that be child abuse, bullying, or even in its worst case, school shooters. And how do we provide a safe environment for kids? And so I guess for that first one, I wanted to emphasize how important, and this is probably a big problem when we've moved so much more to mobile education compared to in-person education, is child abuse detection. 16.2% of child abuse cases are reported by teachers. I think about that because, again, as I said, mobile education is removing them from being able to have that accessibility to talk to their kids and make sure they're okay. And when it comes to what are those forms of abuse, generally its majority is neglect. 59.2% come from that. Then you have physical abuse. You got 18.6% of cases are that. Then you got sexual abuse. 9.6% of cases are that. And then the final part is psychological mistreatment. 6.8% of cases come from that. And so I think about all these kids that are being neglected and abused, and I'm wondering how they're surviving in these environments. And I often think we've been seeing this spike in mental health problems. I can only imagine what that is like for the kids right now who are away from their friends and are in environments that don't make them feel comfortable, and their parents are being stressed out potentially even more from having to administer childcare duties during the day when they're supposed to be working. So yeah, that's a major concern for me. Jackie, is there anything you wanted to add on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the biggest arguments for opening back up. We know that some children are safer at school, and that's so fucking heartbreaking to even say.
And they get their meals there too.
Yeah, and they get their meals. I mean, like, this is it's just a cascade of failures from the very beginning of these children's lives, and it's just adding insult to injury at every freaking stage of development. That's why. This isn't a UBI episode, but this is why UBI matters. Because parents who are stressed about money can take that stress out on their kids, and that leads to all kinds of, detrimental effects on the kids. So
that's not condoning it. Like, some people totally take this bad faith approach that when we start to say that economic issues can cause stress to people to make bad decisions, that we're somehow explaining away bad decisions, but they are related. Stress is a major source of irrationality and lashing out, frankly, often tearing people down to make yourself feel better. Because you're feeling bad, it's sometimes hard for someone to see happiness around them when you're feeling miserable. And so that ends up in terrible abuse. But I wanted to now talk about bullying. I think this has been a big focus as well in the 21st century. I spent a lot of time in the nurse's office.
I don't know that my elementary school had a counselor. I can't remember her, but I spent a lot of time in the nurse's office because I was like bullied relentlessly by these two girls. It was like their whole life's mission was to make me cry every day. And so I always had a stomach ache, and I was in the nurse's office again. And I think this goes back to having more counselors and just people for kids to talk to. And there's a lot of nowadays, you've seen it over and over again. Children are being bullied. They go to the proper authorities. It's not addressed, and they end up doing awful things to themselves or others. A lot of these really tragic incidences could have been avoided. There were signs all the way up until, So, I mean, for me personally, I was bullied, and I spent a lot of time, hiding, and there wasn't recourse, not back in the day. And I don't see that it's really, it may have only gotten worse because of the social media aspect of it, that children are, I mean, you've seen those like very salacious headlines and stuff, people just doing awful things. And this is like, again, it is this permeation of scarcity and fear and stress. Like, we are so preyed upon by forces, like Marianne Williams would say, those dark psychological forces. But it's true. There are so many ways every single day we're being told to fear and be stressed, and that we need more, that we don't have enough, that we're not good enough. And it just permeates every single aspect of society and school and children and social media. It's just this absolutely toxic combination, just the worst kind of perfect storm.
It really is. And I have to say, just like you have a very personal connection to this issue, I have a very personal connection to bullying, and I think a lot of people who might even be listening to this will as well. 20.2% of students report having been bullied. I'll say from my own experience, I'm thankful that it didn't happen in middle school or high school when social media rised. I faced my main bully from 2nd to 5th grade, who was my next door neighbor, and it was still an excruciating experience and traumatic for me. But it also, like later in life, was a very, very instructive moment for me, because you start to realize about how often it's not inherently evil people who are being bullied. It's hurt people who are being bullied. And my bully at the time, I found out, was being majorly stressed from his parents getting divorced and from his sister getting mauled by dogs. And so those two things can put a lot of stress on a family, and thus on a kid in that family. And that sometimes gets lashed out into inappropriate places. I'm not saying what he did to me was right, but I at least came to understand him and not think of him as evil like I thought of him at the time. At the time, as a kid, that was my only thought. I didn't have the ability at that time to step back and try and understand who the person was. But that is another reason why counselors are so necessary. It's not just for the bullied. It is for the bullies. The bullies too
probably need it more. Hurt people hurt people. And I love that that quote that says villains are just victims you haven't heard their stories yet. I mean, that's essentially people that are well balanced and happy aren't generally bullying other people. They're usually in some kind of emotional turmoil themselves. And they just,
or some just insecurity.
And this goes back to educating children on emotional control. And I don't think that, I mean, we should be talking about mindfulness, meditation, gratitude, all these hippy dippy shit that like is proven 100% in the lab to like.
I mean, hey, I took that in college. We can bring those type of things into the primary school education. I took a course called The Way of Happiness.
Children who are taught meditation and mindfulness and just slowing down and breathing, like even one of just centering yourself and just taking a pause, even the pause, just teaching children to take a pause can be so powerful, and it's cheap, it's free. This is like totally something that we could institute tomorrow that would reduce this kind of thing. And there is science behind it. So I don't know why we're not doing more of that. Honestly.
I agree.
This is some stuff that very cheap solutions, like the things that I call stupid simple, where it's just like, this is a solution. This is a problem. We can do this very cheaply, institute it pretty easily. I mean, instead of pledging the allegiance, we just do a 5-minute
Oh my God. We're not even going to do a big deep dive into that. There could be a whole other segment we do on American propaganda, done through our education system. Yes. But I want to table that for now and wrap up on this subject of bullying. I want to provide some statistics for the people out there of bullying cases. How is it really being done? So physical bullying is generally being done. 6% of men report being physically bullied, and women are 4%. When it comes to things like being the subject of rumors, women report it 18% of the time, and men report it 9% of the time. And then finally, when it comes to things like being excluded from activities on purpose, like social isolation, women report this 7% of the time versus men 4% of the time. And so for bullying holistically now, 24% of women report being bullied, and only 17% of men. And I actually think this is a very interesting statistic because I don't think this is how it's shown often in media. Mm-hmm. Very often it's shown when it's in the school setting, it's just men being bullied. And then when it comes to bullying for women, it's purely only the social media side of things. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this captures that it is not the case where it is such a disparity in the school setting in favor of men. And in fact, more often than not, women are facing the issue of bullying right now. Yeah. And so I think we do need to be mindful of that. Yeah, they can. And so, some other statistics that we can provide on bullying is that, 41% of those who had been bullied believed that it was going to happen to them again, that it's not an isolated incident. It is usually a repeated pattern of behavior where it's not something where you can tell someone to just get over it or ignore it or report it to a teacher and the teacher's just ignoring it. It's going to keep happening. And so you need something to be able to address that. And, obviously we can be doing more to make sure that these adults are informed. Only 46% of people who have been bullied said that they actually informed an adult about it. But we also do need to have more action on this. And frankly, we need to have teachers, kind of like we do with policing, positioned in high bullying areas, like we have for policing and focusing on high violent crime areas. We need focus on high bullying areas. And that usually comes in the hallways and stairwells at schools. 43% of bullying cases have been reported to go there. Inside the classroom is 42% of the cases. In the cafeteria is 27%. Outside on school grounds is 22%, online or by text, which generally seems to be the big narrative that people are pushing for the increase in bullying, is only 15%. And then, in the bathroom or locker room is 12%, and on the school bus is 8%. So a lot of actual bullying is still in schools, and it's being done at the hallways, just through the hallways where, people are going in between classes and in the classroom. Yeah. And so we need presence there to make sure that it's being broken up and it's being deterred.
Yeah, this has got to go back to teachers to student ratio. I mean, if there were more teachers in the classroom, or if classrooms were smaller in general, I can't imagine that bullying would be, people would be getting away with it. Teachers would be able to see it happening, intercede, or even prevent it. I just can't imagine. It's got to be it's got to correlate somehow.
Yeah. And here's the thing that really breaks my heart is I think a lot of the root causes of why people bully others carries over to a general culture of bigotry and discrimination. that is
For sure.
how they get into adults. Like the biggest reasons that are cited for bullying are most often students' physical appearance, race and ethnicity, gender, disability, religion, and sexual orientation. Kids need to be taught that that does not fly. And so when we start early and say that bullying is unacceptable, we start to enforce those behaviors as unacceptable for adults.
And where are they learning that from?
I mean, part of it obviously probably comes from homes, as we were talking about. A lot of the troubles are being brought with them. And so, it's, again, it comes with rebuilding the home life too, and the general society if we want to improve education experiences. But I actually think it's also go ahead.
Asian, and he said he's been, they've blamed him for COVID and shit. Like that's happening right now. Yeah. And I mean, he's 9 years old. Like, what are these kids? So they learn it from their parents and social media and TV and all that stuff. And I'm not one of those people that are like, oh, TV, but there is something to be said about watching or monitoring what your children are consuming, because ultimate knowledge, kids shouldn't have ultimate knowledge.
I fully agree with you. For my own personal anecdote, my youngest cousin, his name is Jack. I remember during his experience going through middle school, like late middle school and high school, he largely was someone who kind of identified with the alt-right. He kind of got sucked into like the anti-SJW kind of pipeline. And a lot of this was being reinforced by just like how kids make fun of each other, like even in playful insults, like calling each other gay, even when they're not gay. All these things are the very frequent things. It's when people start saying these are problems and we shouldn't be doing this and this is insensitive, they're like, oh, just you guys need to lighten up, take a joke. And I try to not be too much of a fanboy, but this is one of the things I am dearly most thankful to like Andrew Yang about, is the dude pulled my cousin out of that pipeline and into a new like humanitarian mindset. And I'm just so deeply thankful for him on that. But to pull back to just wrap up on the bullying point, I just want to say how important it is to actually measure these problems and actually try to do something about it. It actually works. So in 2005, when we started actually tracking bullying, the bullying rate was at 28%. For reference, what we cited before of the bullying rate was 20.2% now. So that is a decline in bullying over time. Furthermore, we have found that school-based bullying prevention programs decrease bullying by up to 25%, according to the Congressional Research Service. So when we talk about these things, we're not talking in this esoteric, thing of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if bullying stopped? Shouldn't we be nicer in schools? No, actual programs work. Tracking the success of these programs helps work, and we need to be investing in these efforts. That is my final thoughts on bullying. Do you have any final thoughts you wanted to add, Jackie?
Yeah, I'll say this all the time. When you call the demon by its name, it loses its power. Same thing with bullying. If we keep sweeping it under the rug, then it doesn't get addressed. But if we bring it out into the light, if we say this is a problem and we're not going to tolerate it any longer, and people talk about social justice warriors, language is changing, and we need to just evolve, because it's like a lower vibration thing. I don't want to be too hippie, but if we are calling each other agates and bitches, and we're just like, we're putting that out into the universe, and we're denigrating each other, even jokingly, but it's still denigrating. It's still negative. So we need to be more conscious and aware of our voices and what comes out of our mouth, because this shit is powerful. It's important. We need to be mindful. We need to teach children that words have power, that, they used to say sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's bullshit. We know that's not true. So stop lying to children and telling them to suck it up and actually advocate for them instead. And provide the necessary resources and information and call the demon by its name and say, no, we will not tolerate that anymore. We see you.
Yeah, I think one of the points you just made there that really resonated with me is I think when we tolerate this bullying culture, it disseminates into just our interpersonal relationships that we think are just friendships. I will say people who I considered my very good friends, best friends, in fact, during high school, in fact, did some of the worst bullying to me. Like on reflection, it was unacceptable, but I took it as standard abuse because I thought that's what friends do. We tease each other. We make each other's lives hard and we laugh it off. Ha ha ha. But really, it hurts the people. Like I will say, my peer group at that time would repeatedly just poke me in the sides during class, and I would gain anxiety when my teacher would call me out because I was fidgeting and disrupting in the classroom because I was literally getting poked from both sides by people I thought were my friends, and they were just getting me into trouble. I was called a faggot repeatedly, and that made me have really deep questions about my sexuality because, I'm in a better looking state now, healthier state now, but I was a chubby kid, insecure, going through puberty and not sure about my full sexuality at the time. I had a lot of insecurity, and they really poked fun at that, and it really hurt at that time. And frankly, they even spread rumors about me that, like, hell, that I ate ass. Now it's become more socially acceptable and I would not care. But at that time, how embarrassing is it for an individual kid to have strangers going through the hall asking someone about that and then finding out your very best friend is the person who spread that and maligned your character? It gets socially tolerated for friends to be fucking assholes when we tolerate bullying from other people and we don't treat it as a serious problem.
Yes, and it also permeates to later relationships also. What you tolerate, it signals to other people your standards and your boundaries. And if you show people, the wrong people, that you don't have boundaries or standards or self-respect, they're going to take advantage.
Pushing. They just keep pushing.
And this is absolutely from personal experience. I mean, the way you're treated, the way you allow yourself to be treated, it's important that you know your self-worth.
And that goes back to why one of the things I said is we should have people be treated in self-defense. And I think part of self-defense is understanding how to handle just people who are being emotional assholes, essentially, to you. It's knowing how to defend yourself in those circumstances where you don't let them get to you, or you know how to play it off so that they don't get the satisfaction that they want.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But now I wanted to turn to the very last topic on this subject of trying to keep schools safe. And that is the police in school versus school shootings, because they very often are getting kind of tied together of why we have them. And so I just want to provide some statistics around the conversation. First, this comes from Everytown USA. In 2021, there has been at least 29 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, and this has resulted in 9 deaths and 11 injuries nationally. And this is while schools haven't been fully reopened all nationwide. And so these are still 9 kids who died in school. And that is still a tragedy. Like some people are like, oh, who cares? It's not that many. No, that is a tragedy. The individual cost has a big psychological impact to many others beyond the sole direct victims, and it impacts their families and their communities, feeling this general unsafeness. And so, let's keep going.
Just last week.
Yeah. And I think this is why these things get national attention, is because they really grip at the psyche when the environments that we think should be, relatively innocent, safe for kids, a nurturing environment, they're not. They're still unsafe, and we have a lot of work to do. And so let me continue with some additional statistics. This now comes from the Sandy Hook Promise statistics. And for reference, for those that don't remember, Sandy Hook is a specific instance of a mass shooting in a school. Happened back in December 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut, where 26 people were killed within the school, including 20 kids. And some of the statistics that they provide are really unsettling. So firearms are the second leading cause of death among children and adolescents after car crashes. The U.S. has had
that fact itself, and I'm sorry, the thing that makes me so mad. We're not even talking about gun control, but what people do not realize is how many children and youngin are dying by firearms. Completely 100% preventable. Absolutely unnecessary. Yeah. It's so ridiculous that we are so gun happy in this country. There are literally more guns in this country than there are human beings. And you are more likely to be killed by your child with a gun than you are by a terrorist. I'm sorry. Continue.
Jeez. Yeah.
I live in Texas.
Deeply unsettling
Everybody
statistic.
has guns. There's more gun shops in Texas than there are entire gun nations have. So,
yeah, I would believe that. But let me provide some additional statistics here. So the U.S. has had 1,316 school shootings since 1970, and the numbers have been increasing. 18% of school shootings have taken place since the tragedy at Sandy Hook. In a comprehensive study of school shootings from 1974 to 2000, conducted by the Secret Service and Department of Education, 93% of school shooters plan the attack in advance. These aren't things done on a whim, and there are a lot of warning factors. Guns used in about 68% of gun-related incidents at school were taken from the home, a friend, or a relative. People they knew. It wasn't that they just acquired an illegal gun or went to a gun show or bought it illegally.
Yeah, this is another one of those
got it
myths.
From people they knew.
This is another one of those anti-gun control myths that if we take away guns, which nobody says they're going to take away guns, then only the bad people would have it. But most of these, like you said, are being done with family guns. People they know. They're not coming from the back of a car. These are coming from people's homes. So
yeah, and the problem is parents are ignorant of the fact that their kids actually know where their guns are. 39% of parents wrongly believe that their children don't know where it is. And an estimated 4.6 million American children live in a home where at least one gun is kept loaded and unlocked. So, that being said, I think it's safe to say that the problem starts at home and bringing accountability to the people you know. And so, obviously, we'll go into this in future months, themes, whatever, when we get to gun control eventually in coverage. But we need to start assessing a chain of custody and liability for the people that are giving these things over. If you got it from your parents and you took it out, your parents should be held liable for that, for having improper gun storage. If you got it from a relative or a friend, they should be held liable for that, for giving you that gun. That is how it should work. If you gave someone a gun and they were not cleared to have that gun and you did not go through the formal process, you should be held accountable. Because it's frankly just unacceptable how easy people are getting these things from people they know. I know it's not going to eliminate all of it. I said it's only 68%. 32% is still out there.
Yeah.
But that's still going to reduce. Oh, let me do the quick math for us here.
That's just the statistics. I don't understand why people. I am not scared. I'm not afraid of my fellow Americans. This is that whole fear thing. I don't understand why people feel the need to have a freaking loaded firearm in their house for this supposed boogeyman and they're going to be a hero and John Wayne it up. That's not what happens. What happens is your kid finds it and they kill you or they kill themselves. And then what happens? I would love to see a survey of people who've had these tragedies and how they feel about guns after that. And if they still have loaded guns in their homes. Because this is the whole like lack of imagination and empathy thing. It's not until it happens that people can possibly imagine something. When it happens every day, constantly. I remember in a Walmart, a woman's 2-year-old baby took her loaded gun out of her purse in Walmart and shot the woman. The woman was a literal rocket scientist. You can look this up. She was a literal rocket scientist. She had a loaded gun in her purse and her son killed her. This is America. Like, this is what we prioritize.
That is crazy.
You can have guns, but you can't have a school lunch.
Just because I was also doing that quick math from before. Like, if we eliminated that 68% we were talking about of the people who get the guns from people they know, their homes, etc., that'd be eliminating 895 out of the 1,316 school shootings.
Preventable.
That would be very preventable.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, I think both of us can realize that we're not going to ever truly get it to zero. Right. I think we can say that. But we should get it as close as damn possible. I don't think that's unreasonable.
I think it is important to compare ourselves to the rest of the world because there are countries that have just as much guns like per person, because I think it's Sweden. We have the most, but like that they still have very highly armed societies, but they do not have the instances, and that's the security, that's the economic, mental, financial, spiritual. All of those things are when we are in America chasing our tails in this scarcity trap. And we're terrified of getting sick because we could just lose everything. There's so much stress there. And then other countries that don't have to worry about healthcare or childcare costs or maternity leave or vacation or, all of these things that we just don't even understand. Like, oh, they have high taxes. Yes, but they also don't have to worry about all of these things that we are terrified of. That could just lay us low any day of the week if we were unfortunate enough.
To me, whenever I see these high tax, high benefit nations, all I think about is, wow, look at all those people actually working together to provide for their own common good. They were willing to sacrifice and work together to provide things they all needed. And that's how society should work, is people coming together, helping one another to be able to provide a better life for us all. And then if you want to be successful, go right ahead and pursue that after we've secured those basics for everyone else.
And I'm sure we wouldn't even have to raise that much taxes if our defense budget wasn't so huge. So like that's a whole nother can of worms and this way off topic, but it's priorities, what we choose to fund. School lunches, not so much. Missiles, yes. Let's talk about what we fund instead of those school lunches and all these services as our final point. Let's talk about police in schools. And I think the things that should be kind of stated on this subject is, first, how much we spend on the services in schools currently. Like, what is the scale? In 2017, we were spending $2.7 billion on sales of security equipment and services to public schools. And generally, the impacts of this from a Texas paper we saw is that it showed that when middle or high schools hired more police, students were 1.7 percentage points less likely to graduate high school compared to similar students in the same district in other years. More police also led to slightly lower college enrollment rates as well. And this makes sense when you start to build up a suspension record against you because of more police presence, as well as higher arrest rates. So, you might be asking yourself, what could we do instead of this? We got to keep our kids safe. Well, a lot of it is, as we've been talking about this whole episode, developing proper support systems so less people feel the need to it and have better mental health. But, also simply being able to foster
a climate that does better communication between staff, educators, and students, like an actual culture of respect that truly understands the stakeholders in the environment and the pains that they're going through, has been very effective, much more so than coercive disciplinary practices. This is according to a study entitled School Violence Associations with Controls, Security and Enforcement, Educational/Therapeutic Approaches and Demographic Factors, published in the School Psychology Review by Amanda Nickerson and Matthew Martins. And so, obviously, this kind of ties to a bigger conversation on general policing in society. Mm-hmm. But I think it's clear when it comes to the school environment, this is not helping the kids. This is just, frankly, unfairly targeting certain kids, particularly kids of color and kids with disabilities. These are the groups most often targeted by the police. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this spending of $2.7 billion when we said, as we cited before, 90% of school districts are underfunding their social services in their schools and are inadequately providing counselors, inadequately providing nurses, inadequately providing teachers. Why the fuck are we spending on cops in schools? Like, fund that stuff first.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is this a kind of like police unions thing? Is this like a sweetheart deal where they're just getting a contract with the school district?
Nah, it's not.
Like, how is this even?
It's usually not. It's usually like private contracting to security companies, as well as like surveillance devices and all sorts of other equipment. It's usually not public forces.
I mean, this is the kind of thing that makes me feel like we live in a police state. I mean, when we can't even let children be children. Yeah, we do, because we're being surveilled everywhere we go. So that's kind of
to put it in perspective. Our military budget, not our military budget. I'm comparing it to other nations' military budgets. Our police budget is larger than I think almost every country on earth sends 10, like only 10 military budgets, and one of those includes our own, exceeds like our police budget. And so it's literally like we are funding a military against our civilians. And now, mind you, like I've had conversations, we just recently had them on our program with a police abolitionist. I still think there are roles for police, but like fund the other stuff first. Fund the other stuff first. That's what I gotta say.
It goes again to the whole fear thing and like why people need guns. There is this, there's a book called Our Better Angels. We're actually living in the safest time in human history. But I think because we're so hyper informed, we think stuff is terrible when in actuality, out here in the country, we don't lock our doors. We sleep with the windows open. We don't lock our cars up, nothing like that. And I have lived in places where your shit's been stolen and my apartment's been broken into, all that stuff. But for the most part, we are safer. We are living in a safer time than ever before. And we are so inundated with these cues to be fearful that we think that we are scared of our children. That's crazy. And it's crazy that there are school shootings. Like there's just this like cancer. It's an underlying sickness that we really need to look at the root cause of, and that we know a lot of it is poverty. I mean, like this is why we're always going to come back to UBI, because we live in a capitalist society. You can't go. What did Bill Hicks said? You live in a free country. You think you live in a free country? Try going anywhere without money. We don't. We live in a capitalist society. So if you don't have capital, you're immediately under duress, and then it just cascades. So when we are fearful of our children and we put cops in schools and we spend billions of dollars doing it and we get a 1% decrease, again, it's priorities. What are we prioritizing? We're prioritizing force, coercion, conformity over individuality, nurturing, evolving. Like we are not, we're not being, this is not conducive to growth. It's not. It's so stunting to have this mindset. And I mean, like, this is, everything is so interconnected. We can't talk about school without talking about poverty, without talking about the police state, without talking about healthcare, you know?
I mean, this is why this has been our longest episode of any of them. It's because it is so intersectional, because education is kind of the starting point of every other aspect of society. It's how do we understand society and prepare people for, you know, this kind of cruel world in a sense, and how to, you know, conform right now.
Yeah, and it's a big red flag that we're placing police into that mix. When I'm 41 years old, when I was growing up, we didn't always have police, but I grew up in a very like poor, dangerous neighborhood, and we did have metal detectors and stuff like before that was the norm. Now I think that's like normal now, but back in the day it wasn't. It's
really reserved to only like certain more urban districts that those get kind of employed to. But there was a lot that we got to talk about. Jackie, do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we go into our interview with Gisele Huff, where we talk about a lot of our focus on some of the subjects, especially around technology and how do we evaluate and personalize to students? Do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we head into that interview?
I think for folks that are benefiting from the education system as it is, that's awesome. But I think that we are leaving so many people with potential behind, and that like we aren't doing right by all of our children. And I just can't, I always come back to this, like, my whole entire life, we've been saying the children are our future. We care about the children, but how we show it, it's not. It's like don't tell. You know, like, show me you care about kids by feeding them. Show me you care about kids by giving their parents a UBI so that they can have a freaking roof over the head. Because we didn't even touch on how many homeless children there are in this country. So when we talk about the children being important, they're our future, that we love them, that they matter, then we need to be putting our fucking money where our mouth is. And cops don't belong in schools, neither do recruiters, neither do like religious institutions and organizations. We need to make schools conducive to independent thought, critical thinking, like learning about real skills, not just these abstract things. You know, when I was going to school, they said, you won't always have a calculator. Well, joke's on them. Like we have.
Oh, God, we always have it. Yeah, we always have one now.
I mean, it's just, just from, I'm not even that old. And the education I went through is just, and it felt antiquated at the time. So
hey, I'm even younger than you, and I have the same sentiment.
It's just like, get with it. Everything, these really important, we have let the private sector revolutionize consumer goods while public infrastructures haven't changed in decades. Why aren't schools the fucking innovative hubs of intelligent, you know, like, just really like it has so much potential, and children have so much potential. We are not giving kids, we never have, the proper respect. They are smart. They are with it. These kids today know more than my mom does. You know, like, kids are smart. We need to listen to them. We need to respect them. We need to give them a platform. We need to give them responsibilities, the ones that want it. A lot of kids are squandered because they have that motivation and drive, and they don't have anywhere to put it. So we could be doing so much more. I mean, that's the whole point of this episode was just like, I love teachers. I'm glad they're, I mean, it's heroic work, but we still have so much more to do. And it's the 21st century, and I just don't understand why we're not taking more advantage of technology.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly echo that sentiment. The one final thing I'll say before we go into that interview is the sole focus of education and what we care about is the kids. That's it. Anything else is a distraction. And we didn't go into even some of the things like, heck, how do you set curriculums? How do you do textbooks and all of that? Because there is so much fundamental harm that we are doing to our kids beyond the classroom, in the classroom, that we need to handle. And I want it to be known, the goal of education is not teaching. The goal of education is learning. And so, with that being said, I think this is the perfect point for us to transition into our interview with Gisele Huff, who is a former educator and former educator administrator, and even candidate for who run for office. And as always, we love whenever they are present. She is a very big, prominent UBI advocate. You may remember her from some of our past episodes on the Hill of Roses. So we had a really great time being able to talk with her. And so we were really excited. So we hope you enjoyed our breakdown on the issues of education. One more reminder, please subscribe to the channel as we head into our interview with Gisele Huff.
Hello, our basic friends. We're here with Miss Gisele Huff, the founder of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. We know her as a very passionate, inspirational advocate for UBI, but she also has an extensive history in education. So we asked her to come on the show and give her perspective and her expertise in the basic subject of education. So, Ms. Huff, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background in education?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. And please, Jackie, call me Gisele. Before I retired last November, I was the executive director of a small family foundation in San Francisco that concentrated on, in the first half of my career, and I was with them for 22 years, on reforming K-12 education, and in the second half of my career, actually transforming K-12 education. Before that, I actually was involved with a private school in San Francisco for 12 years where I was the director of development, but I also taught one course in political philosophy, high school, and then I taught a political philosophy pro bono course at the Dominican College in Marin when I retired. In between my retirements, I retired twice. I couldn't stay retired the first time, and I'm not staying retired now either. I'm very busy with the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. It's almost a full-time job. I get paid zero, but I get paid psychically a tremendous amount. So anyway, yeah. I've been involved in fact, when I ran for Congress in '98, my main campaign pitch was doing something about public school education. So I've always had an involvement in education.
Oh, that's wonderful. And Gisele, I know how much you work in the community. It's been roughly 18 months since we got the last talk on the program. It's great to be able to see you again. My first question that I have for you on the subject of education is, in this time period, what do you think has been the real big shifts that we've seen in the education model, specifically for primary schools? How do you think things have changed since the 90s to today? What are some of those major shifts that you think have really happened that have been impactful for kids?
So one of the shifts that began just around the time that I shifted gears in my foundation world, somewhere I would say in around 2005, So I started with the foundation in '98, and reform then was really about looking at the way schooling was delivered, and realizing that the government schools at that time, I was involved in promoting vouchers and charter schools as alternatives to a system that wasn't working very well. I mean, everybody knew it, but no one was doing anything about it. Problem with, it's a $700 billion industry that is a monopoly. Has been since, for all of the last century. And it's got, now it's a really big industry. And you know what happens? Everybody protects their turf. So it's really the shift happened when it became obvious, and this was actually Clayton Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor who coined the term disruptive innovation. He applied his lens of disruptive innovation to two social problems: education and healthcare. And I worked with him on this. I was the chairman of his board for 3 years, and the focus of that was, since education is an industry, why is it the only industry that is not seriously looking at technology? This is in 2005, right? The beginning of the 2000s. And so to respond to your question, the big shift has been to alerting the education establishment to the potential of technology and the painstaking, tedious, glacially slow introduction of technology as an integral part of the curriculum. When you think how much time teachers waste doing grunt work instead of working one-on-one with kids who need it most, you realize, we are at where we are, because we know that the best way to teach a child is one-on-one. Plato and you, Aristotle and you, but that's not the way it is. It's not set up that way. So anyway, that is the biggest change. The acknowledgement that something must be done with technology. And of course, with the pandemic, if we didn't have Zoom, and we didn't have online learning that was already that had already been tried in many different ways with curricula that have been developed, and our kids would have been completely out of the picture for a whole entire year.
Yeah, it's good that we had gone a little bit ahead of time. So,
Yeah.
We obviously understand a little bit of that mobile education from a lot of people going through that. But do you mind talking to some of the other technologies that you were thinking that could be helping teachers avoid some of that grunt work? I think a lot of people, unless they're teachers themselves, might not be exposed to what is actually done to aid teachers. Could you elaborate on how we can help them with technology?
Yes. So the first thing you must ask is, what is the purpose of education? And that's a deep question, and there's much to be discussed there. But if part of it is to impart skills to children, it's really skills, knowledge. Knowledge nowadays is, I learn more on Google. If I have any question whatsoever, I don't even have to remember the name of the person. It gives me the most elaborate answers to my questions, right? It's an incredible thing. So, and I went through a PhD program at Columbia University. So, I know in depth, I understand what it means to really learn something. Google is infinite. And Khan Academy, which is a particular, you can learn anything you want on Khan Academy. Yeah, it's anything you want. So the transfer of knowledge is the least thing we need to worry about in terms of education. Skills and dispositions, which were never really spelled out in the many centuries that education has been actually, done, are the most important things in the 21st century, because knowledge is, you don't have to remember anything, but you have to know how to make connections. You have to understand that one of the most dire things that our children must understand now, if this country is going to survive, is how to differentiate between truth and falsehoods. That's, without that, we're gonna. It's and there's no articulation of that as a specific thing, right? I mean, it was all. I don't even think that. I mean, I can't remember any time in my education, which stopped in '77 well, my formal education, when I defended my dissertation, where somebody actually put in front of me, something true and something false, and made me go through the process of defining what I was exposed to many different viewpoints that were not the same, that were antagonistic, but I had to make a decision on what I was reading. There wasn't a truth or a false. There was an opinion to be reached. Well, this is absolutely dire. We have no formal way of doing that. So, the way that if you would think about what we want our children to be able to do, to go back to your question, and how you give teachers more time with the kids at using technology. I'll give you an example. We have the Common Core, where there's a set of objectives that make up the curriculum, the K-12 curriculum. It's not exactly the same in every state, but there are some things that children must know and know how to do that are part of the K-12 curriculum. And there is no national, I mean, the Common Core was a passing thing, but it pretty much is, I mean, there may be arguments at the edges, but the core of what needs to happen, not the content, but the core, the format, the things that you're trying to accomplish are the same for everybody. So why do teachers have to develop their own learning objectives? Why do teachers have to develop their own curricular systems? They spend an inordinate amount of. The woman next door is doing exactly the same thing. The total waste of time. The objectives are universal. So there's no reason why they have to recreate the objectives. Given that you now have, and everybody accepts the objectives, the objectives tell nothing about the way the teacher imparts them. It's just the standard to which the teacher, that the child has to reach, right? I mean, it's the learning objectives is what the child has to accomplish as the child goes through the system. So now you've taken away the need for the teachers to write their own curriculum, I mean, to write their own, daily system of what they're teaching. And there is one of the projects that the foundation I worked for supported was something called Mastery Track. This is a dashboard. It doesn't care how or what the teacher does in the classroom, but it measures on a dashboard whether the kids have learned it. Education isn't about teaching, it's about learning. You can teach your heart out with dancing girls from Las Vegas, and if the kids didn't get it, it's worthless. It was great entertainment, but it had nothing to do with what they needed to know and know how to do. So this dashboard, you just plug into it, you put in the names of your kids, you put all the objectives that have already been given to you as a teacher that you don't have to worry about, and you teach however you want, using whatever methods you feel comfortable with, or in your career you've had some very charismatic teachers who make it fun. You've had some really boring teachers, but who gave you a lot of information and a lot of sleeping on the desk thinking of Bueller, So it doesn't matter how the teacher teaches, but the teacher can see whether the children have learned. And when she sees or he sees a major problem, they can intervene. They can find an intervention that will address that particular problem for that particular kid on Tuesday. Not the next year when that problem will mean he can't learn algebra because he doesn't know how to do long division. Because nobody knew he didn't know how to do long division, because in 5th grade, he passed with a C, which is a kind of a 70. Well, we don't know what the 30% is. So the point of education is not to accumulate information, then regurgitate it with a standard that gives a numerical assessment to it, and then say, well, if you got a 70 in 5th grade, then you're good to go. But when you get in 8th grade and you got 3 algebra, you're out of luck, and nobody knows why. Oh, he can't learn algebra. And guess what? Algebra is the gateway to college.
Yeah, this is very much like the healthcare basic, universal basic service, in that we laud and applaud analytics and data. We are awash in it, but in these incredibly important areas of our lives and our children's lives, it just goes right out the window. We don't use this technology and data and information that could really help kids that are struggling or falling through the cracks. Like you said, there are some things that we could absolutely do, like today, that would improve education down the line for the rest of history. And like you said, it just goes so slow. What are some of the holdups to implementing some of these disruptive technologies and innovations?
You're dealing with a bureaucracy, and trying to change a bureaucracy is very, very difficult. We know that. You're also dealing with the discomfort of adapting to new technologies. You're dealing with the antiquated methodologies of schools of ed, right? I mean, teachers come out of the schools of ed. The schools of ed are the cash cows of middling colleges, the kind of, especially state universities. They're the cash cow. People, they barely changed since the 1950s. And fundamentally, never mind the expressions of all of this today, fundamentally, our curriculum was created in 1893 by the Committee of 10. And has, obviously, the content has changed, as science has changed, but it changes every 7 years when they redo the textbooks. Right? I mean, Pluto was no longer a planet 7 years after the kids. Yeah. So what does that do to the trust or the relevance that education has for kids when they run into these things that are no longer true, but they're still in their textbooks? So how do they view their textbooks? Another project, by the way, is that the foundation I worked for funded was the open source, where all the textbooks are actually online. And if Pluto is no longer a planet on Tuesday, on Wednesday it's no longer a planet in the textbook. Duh.
So that's another one of those industry things too. Yeah, because that is big money. Yeah.
The publishers and all the people who service, the districts. I mean, the relationship between the vendors. Many of the people who are against, money in schools, like charter schools, again, always screaming, no, it should be pure, no money. But what are they talking about? I mean, everybody gets paid, and lots of people make huge amounts of money. The publishers being one of them. So, so the curriculum is based on an 1893 group of 10 men who got together, and plus their staff. I mean, it was a year-long thing, and they created a curriculum. And then in 1906, Carnegie created a Carnegie Units, which is there was a way to track the teachers. That has become really the infrastructure of the way our public education system is conducted. And they say this is 2021. Hello, it's about time we take a good look at what's going on, and this is what needs to be transformed. Until we transform this, until we ask the why question and we decide what it is we want our kids to know in the 21st century, in a country that's coming apart, where people don't know the truth from falsehoods anymore, where we don't have we don't agree on facts. Well, we have to really, and this is where it happens. This is where you learn how to do that stuff.
And we're not teaching it. Gisele, you made a point that I thought kind of reminded me of Jackie's point before about how education and healthcare have parallels. Your point about textbooks kind of having this stranglehold over the education process, because essentially they have the same information, they try and reprint it every year, and they have this licensing deal with sometimes the universities to make sure that they are the sole provider of textbooks, and they just keep on making you buy it because they're like, okay, not a lot of the information in it has changed, but it's a whole new book. Maybe we changed some problems in the back, but you got to go buy it again. And now the buyback process, oh, well, no, I'm sorry, you're not getting any value from that. And that reminds me a lot about the pharmaceutical industry and how it does that often with its drugs to make sure that the patent doesn't expire.
Right.
So you're absolutely right that there is still private influence that's going to be in the education system, even if you just have public schools. So, I wanted to ask you, in terms of disruptors, we've talked the past 20 years. I'd love to ask you where you think going forward, what we need to be looking for as new technologies for the next, let's say, 5 years. Do you think that mobile education is going to be more of a new norm, or do you think people are going to be looking to return in mass back to in-person in classroom after the pandemic?
Before the pandemic, it was never the case that people thought that people in my space, people who were concerned about the introduction of technology as a tool, thought that the schools would not be still the place that children went for quite a long time. I mean, eventually not. The concept of school, the concept of walls, the concept of every child learning the same thing at every age, this is completely nonsensical. I mean, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, they look back on this and say, what kind of idiots were those people? I mean, if we were and learned differently, and we can give them Aristotle in a box, We don't have to worry about it. That's where technology may well go, which is, I think, parallel. In fact, the reason that Clayton Christensen did those two subjects, healthcare and education, is because they're very similar. Just as you pointed out, Jackie, and you, John, the things that affect them work the same way. They're stuck in the same. Gerald had written in 2017 an essay about how a child would be educated, a day in the life of a child. And I'll share it online because it's very interesting. And it's a child who's being educated at home. But in the course of his day, he's 11 years old. In the course of his day, he's learning about social justice, and he's learning about Martin Luther King Jr., and he's able to insert himself in the speech. I have a dream. Okay? The technology enables him to do that. And at the same time, he can calculate the square, how many people are he gets a lesson in math about how many people were standing in the. So, this is Gerald was a genius. He was a visionary, and so he married. He was very concerned about education because of what it means. It means a great deal to UBI too. If we don't have the right kind of people, UBI ain't gonna happen.
Or even if it does happen, we might not use it properly if we're not educated on how to use it well.
Right. That's right.
That segues great into one of my questions. I was really curious about how you think your background in education influenced your son, Gerald, and what was it like being an educator's son at home? Were y'all always reading?
Well, he was not only an educator's son at home, but he actually took my course when I was teaching at the high school where he went, and he was in my course, and he earned an A purely on merit, you can be sure.
Oh, okay.
Well, I have to tell you something about my son. So you see that I'm a very verbal person. I'm very verbose, and I'm very open to other people's opinion. But I get into discussions with people, and it's very seldom that in the course of the discussion, I might, think about something a person says and absorb it and agree to the extent that it's been put forward. But usually when I make a categorical statement, people just take it as it is. My son, on a regular basis, I would say, Gerald, blah, 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 just, my usual way of addressing things. And he would say, but Mom, and then the pin would come out, and he would puncture my balloon several times a month. I mean, several times. So we were intellectual soulmates in addition to being mother and son. And when he was younger, of course, that was not the case. It was only as we got older. And he's the one who introduced me to UBI. I was a libertarian. I ran as a Republican when I ran for Congress because I didn't buy the big state idea, and he transformed me into a different person after 2008 when the economic disaster struck, and it was clear that it was nobody's fault but the systems. Right, the people who got caught up in that, who lost their homes, who lost their jobs, it wasn't their fault. They'd been doing the right thing years, but so
that was my mom. She lost her house.
This is so,
and that's where I learned about UBI and
Oh, is that how you?
Advocate. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that'll do it. When you see something that's so unfair.
Yeah. She should have had the house nearly paid off, and then it was like she owed $100,000 still. It was just insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy how so many people kind of gotten woke up by that kind of crash, because it finally taught us that it's like, you know what? Even if we think we're all individuals, we are very dependent on the system itself. And so, I guess my final question is, Gisele, in your mind, education, and there's a lot of different people, as you said, what is education meant to do? Some people debate about how much education we should be providing in terms of, at least from a public level. What is your opinion for how much public education we should be providing to people, like in terms of the ages of life or different facilities like pre-K, college, etc.?
So it really depends. Average is over. Average. We've been using average to make all kinds of policy decisions and all kinds of setting up systems. We take an average, and average doesn't mean anything. We have the possibility now, as I was alluding to before, in kind of a facetious way, of putting Aristotle in a box. I mean, he was the mentor for Alexander the Great, and we could do that for every child at some point with the technology we can develop. So the question you're asking is really about what are the capacities of each person? What does each person, you couldn't teach me to play basketball even when I was young. I'm totally non-athletic. I mean, I could have practiced 1,000,000 hours, not 10,000, but I would never have been able to get that stupid ball into a basket. No way. And there are people who are not meant. I mean, they don't feel comfortable. They don't like it for intellectual activities. If you have an economic system that takes care of everybody regardless of what their contribution is, then everybody can develop themselves as they see fit. The same kind of thing you want for UBI, you have to make available for all the other things in life, because you can't control any other human being. Only you can control yourself. That's the only thing that you can do, is control yourself. You can try to manipulate other people, or lead other people, inspire other people, but everybody is their own selves, right? Their own person. So I don't put a value on education writ large, including college, in and of itself. I put a value, an enormous value on it as it relates to every individual person. I don't want to rob a person who is musically inclined and couldn't care less about reading a book of his ability or her ability to pursue a career in music or dance or, or skating or any, whatever it is anybody wants to do. In our society, because success is geared to making money, and making money has been linked to getting a college education, although it's not true that just because you get a college education, you make money. That's not true. You make, on average, statistically, make more money in your lifetime than people who didn't go to college. But that doesn't mean anything for John Munitz, right? Nothing.
Doesn't necessarily.
But
so Gisele, let me follow up on that. So I think we can kind of agree on adults and being able to make their own choice. They don't necessarily have to be pigeonholed into anything. But I think a lot of people can agree that the K through 12 process was a good investment by society to educate children. Do you think that should be expanded to basically age 0 or age 1 for kids to have basically universal pre-K as well?
So the problem, sitting here and looking at the education system, the K-12 education system in 2021, where 38% of 8th graders are proficient in math, not advanced, proficient. That means 62% are not proficient. I think that's in English, and 34% in math, or the other way around. I worry drastically about expanding, making you go down to the lower level of children when we have a huge problem with childcare providers. They're not paid enough. They're not trained well. I mean, we had Head Start for decades, and the results are not good. They're not bad, but they're not. So one of the things about education up until now, up until this century, because of the way our economic system ran and the way the global economy ran, it was good enough. Good enough is not good enough anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly agree with you that we shouldn't be trying to just expand an existingly flawed model.
There you go.
But I think the notion that some of these numbers that you quote of people being insufficient by 8th grade, I wonder how that disparity varies by if they had preschool education versus not, because they can potentially start that like reading process earlier and have learned their letters by the time they're getting to kindergarten. So I am certainly an advocate of doing a model of pre-K as a basic. I'm not saying it has to be the existing way we do our education, but I do think that is a basic to also be a form of childcare for parents who do wish to work. I'm not saying everyone needs to be pressured out of the home or anything like that. People should be stay-at-home mothers and be able to even educate their children at that age. But I feel like that should be a basic option. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I think that, yeah, and I think in the context of recovering from or reform or transforming the economy, I think that what President Biden is talking about, that it's infrastructure to enable people to go to work.
Yeah,
it's infrastructure. I mean, if you want the economy to keep rolling along, you have to make it possible for people to go to work. So that means you have to have good transportation systems. You have to make sure that they're properly treated by their employers, that healthcare is adequate, that people who want to work and have children, because now there was a time, that there was only one person in the family who worked, and you build a perfectly wonderful middle class life on the salary of one person. That was in the middle of the last century, right? So I'm not saying, women want to, and there's been women are just as capable. I don't want to get into that, but there's no reason in the world why women can't be. And, Gerald was a stay-at-home dad for half the week. I mean, for 3 days a week, he worked at home and he was a stay-at-home dad. And so, women can do whatever they want to. But especially when in the lower economic levels, those are not choices these people have. So to that extent, absolutely, I would. We know that rich people enrich the lives of their children every day of the week. Too much. Ballet lessons, tennis, play dates. It's too much. No kid goes around, spends Saturday on his bike, driving around and going to the matinee.
You're describing that tiger parent mentality a little bit. Yeah. That's a little bit overbearing, but yeah, you're right. They're investing in the kid, and you know what? The results, at least in like standardized tests, it shows.
Oh,
I know. I said the evil word.
Yes,
oh boy.
I feel like Miss Giselle's perspective could be simplified in personalized versus standardized, which I couldn't agree more with, because I had severe learning disabilities. I'm dyslexic. I have head trauma, the whole nine. But I consider myself, smart. I'm incredibly inquisitive. I want to know. Like, I have a lifelong thirst for knowledge, but I did not fit into that square pegs in schools. I was in remedial classes. I still am not good at, the maths, because I get my numbers mixed up. But I still feel like I am a good student. When I got into college and I could take my own courses and kind of build my own curriculum, that was a game changer. So maybe even like K through 12 should be kind of like that. Like, what are you interested? Let's build your curriculum around that. And you can learn from the things that you're passionate about. And then you're going to be so much more apt to actually absorb that information, as opposed to like being force fed it and hating every minute. Like, I was so resentful a lot of times of my teachers and classes, but I had incredible teachers that like changed my life, because they did invest, because they did take that one-on-one time with me. And that was all the difference in the world. And my mom, even though she worked 2 jobs and went to night school herself, she made sure we read before we went to school. Before I went into kindergarten, I knew my ABCs and I knew how to read very basic stuff. So I think also we put a lot of pressure and maybe too much of the onus on teachers, and maybe not enough on parents doing their own bit.
Well, that's for sure. Parents have abdicated, and parents do not. Sure. When we were in my time, when parents, I was the only woman who, when my first child was born in 1958, I was the only woman in my circle who went back to work, and I wasn't a professional. I was a secretary. But I went back to work, and there were no other women in my circle, sort of middle class, who worked. Only their husbands worked, and they stayed home and took care of the children. So we have to create a system all around, a system of life where each of us can pursue who we are without suffering.
Feeling bad about who we're not.
And
I
not
call that positive liberty. That's what I feel in it.
There you go. And it should apply to every aspect of our lives. And that doesn't mean that you can be whatever you want, because if you want to be a social human being, other people have to accept you. You don't have a passport, that automatically gets people to like you or to want to associate with you. You have to establish relationships and so on. You have to take other people's desires into account. I'm sure many people have friendships that are with one little thing that really is quite annoying or quite distressing, but the friendship is, or marriages, but the relationship is worth more than that thing, right? And you have to make those decisions all the time. But the demands we make on each other, or the criteria that we establish, are completely unnatural. They're made up, like race. Race is a made-up concept. We could just as well have said tall people and short people, instead of black people, yellow people, white people, and white people, and brown people. Really, yeah. It could just as well have said that. It's not a real thing. So we live in institutions and processes that were created before us by people like us, but mostly men.
People like me. I guess.
Like me. Yeah. We would have done a much better job.
It's true. We've learned a little bit since then, but I think your point is very true on the fact of these are artificial barriers of division for us. The literal term of white and black was invented around the 17th century as a way for us to justify the slave trade that we were doing to the Americas, so that we had to feel like we were separated from these people. So we invented labeling to make ourselves feel a little bit better about ourselves. They're not us. They're this other group that can be subjugated. So you're absolutely right. It's a false term to simply divide us and justify cruelty in a lot of ways. But Gisele, I really want to thank you for taking the time today to be able to join us for this education episode. Do you have any final thoughts or things you'd like to share with the audience as we're wrapping up today?
Well, I think that if you have children, you should let them be what they want to be.
That's beautiful. It's very simple, but it's so true. I mean, don't force your dreams onto them. Let them have their own.
There you go.
It's like when you were their age, how did you feel when your parents pressured you into that? You probably hated it. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful message to end on. So Gisele, again, it's so much of a pleasure to be able to hear from you again. We hope you'll stop by in the future as well.
I would love to. I would love to. It's great to meet you, Jackie.
Thank you so much for talking with us. I'm a big fan.
My pleasure.
Well, that's wonderful. So, everyone, this has been another episode of The People's Basics. We want you all to make sure that you check the description section down below for more of the resources from today's episode, as well as to be able to join our community. As well, please like our content and leave us some feedback or comments to help us with the algorithm and let us know how we can be making even better content in the future. With that being said, that concludes another episode. We'll talk to you all soon, friends. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.
A rose by any other name still advocates just as sweet. Rosebuds, the Hill of Roses is no more. We are now the People's Basics. In the coming months, we'll be rolling out a new website, our comic series, and rewards to help support our new startup, media, and technology venture. In the meantime, check out our new podcast, The People's Basics, with hosts Jackie Sawicki and I, Jonathan Munitz, where we'll be breaking down a different societal basic each week with our friends, colleagues, and experts. Join us, and let's get back to the universal basics. Please help us by appeasing the algorithm gods with a like, share, subscribe, and hitting that bell today. Stay basic, my friends.